History is not a solid wall, but a veil riddled with shadows. Beyond the reach of our modern arrogance lies a terrifying truth. We are not the first to hold the keys to this world. Deep beneath the shifting sands and within the suffocating grip of overgrown jungles, there are places where the air feels heavy with a consciousness that should have died eons ago. These are not mere ruins of stone. They are scars on the face of time. We find artifacts that defy logic and chambers that pulse with an invisible, rhythmic dread. No inscriptions explain their purpose, no myths dare to name their architects. We are staring into a void of forgotten sovereignty, where the only thing more chilling than what we have lost is the realization that something might still be waiting in the dark, watching us rediscover the crumbs of its empire. Across a windswept plateau in northern Laos, thousands of massive stone vessels lie scattered as if placed by a vanished hand. Some stand upright, others are toppled, half buried in the earth, their hollow interiors exposed to centuries of rain and silence. Each one weighs tons. Each one was carved from a single block of stone, and yet no inscription, no written record, no surviving tradition explains who made them, or why. This is not a ruin in the conventional sense. There are no walls, no temples, no cities surrounding them, just jars, over 2,000 of them, spread across hills and valleys for hundreds of kilometers. A civilization left behind a message in stone. But whatever that message was, it has not survived. The Plain of Jars lies in the highlands of Xiangkhouang province, a landscape of rolling grass, scattered forests, and quiet ridgelines that overlook wide open valleys. At first glance, it does not look like the setting of one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. But as the mist lifts, the terrain reveals its anomaly stone vessels appearing in clusters, positioned on elevated ground as if deliberately placed to overlook the land below. Local communities had long known of these jars. They were part of folklore, woven into stories of giants who once inhabited the region, beings said to have forged the jars to brew rice wine after great victories. But to the outside world, the site remained largely unknown until the early 20th century. In the 1930s, French archaeologist Madeleine Colani conducted the first systematic study. She mapped dozens of sites and excavated around the jars, proposing that they were linked to ancient funerary practices. Her work transformed a local curiosity into an international enigma. Then, the research stopped. During the Vietnam War, this region became one of the most heavily bombed landscapes on Earth. Millions of unexploded ordnance buried the plateau beneath a second, more recent layer of danger. For decades, large parts of the Plain of Jars were inaccessible. A prehistoric mystery was effectively sealed off by modern warfare. Only in the last few decades has careful demining allowed archaeologists to return. The question is deceptively simple. What were these jars for? At first glance, they resemble containers. Their cylindrical forms are hollowed out with surprising precision, some with internal ledges or rims suggesting that lids may once have sealed them. A few stone discs found nearby are believed to be those missing covers. But if they were containers, what did they contain? Water? Grain? Something? Ritual? The dominant theory suggests that the jars were part of a complex mortuary system. Bodies may have been placed inside the jars, left to decompose, and later the remains were collected and buried nearby. A form of secondary burial, one that separates the decay of the body from its final resting place. It is a compelling idea. It explains the scale, the durability, the permanence, but it is not complete, because not all jars contain evidence of human remains. Some are entirely empty, others are surrounded by burials that do not seem directly connected to the jars themselves. And the sheer number of jars, thousands across dozens of sites, raises a deeper question. Why would a culture require such an enormous, labor-intensive system for dealing with death? Excavations around the jars have revealed fragments of an ancient story, but never the full narrative. Archaeologists have uncovered human bones, often buried in pits near the jars rather than inside them. Some remains show signs of cremation, others do not, suggesting multiple burial practices coexisting within the same cultural framework. Alongside the bones, there are beads, ceramic vessels, iron tools, objects that imply ritual status and belief. Radiocarbon dating places much of this activity between roughly 500 BCE and 500 CE during the Iron Age of Southeast Asia. This was not a primitive society. It was a culture capable of metalworking, long-distance trade, and organized labor. And yet, the jars themselves raise questions about technological capability. Each vessel was carved from solid rock, often sandstone or conglomerate, and some weigh over 10 tons. Quarry sites have been identified, in some cases several kilometers away from where the jars now stand. There are no clear roads, no evidence of wheeled transport, no inscriptions describing the process. Moving a single 10-ton stone across uneven terrain is difficult even with modern equipment. Moving thousands with ancient tools across a landscape of hills and valleys suggests a level of coordination and engineering that is still not fully understood. Inside the jars, tool marks are visible chiseling patterns, smoothing techniques evidence of human craftsmanship. But they reveal how the jars were shaped, not how they were moved, nor why they were placed with such apparent deliberation across the landscape. The deeper archaeologists look, the more the plain of jars resists a single explanation. The placement of the jars is not random. They are often positioned on elevated ground, overlooking valleys or ancient routes. This suggests intention, visibility, perhaps symbolism. But what kind of symbolism requires thousands of identical stone vessels spread across such vast distances? Some researchers have explored the possibility of astronomical alignment, though no definitive pattern has been confirmed. Others suggest the jars mark territorial boundaries or trade routes, functioning as silent indicators of presence and control. Then there is the question of variation. While many jars share a similar cylindrical form, others differ in size, shape, and finishing detail. Some are roughly carved, others carefully smoothed. This could indicate different time periods, different communities, or evolving practices, but the chronology remains unclear. And perhaps most unsettling of all is the absence of context. Great ancient constructions, pyramids, temples, monuments usually exist within a broader cultural framework. They are part of cities, surrounded by inscriptions, tied to rulers or gods. The plain of jars stands apart. It is a landscape of objects without an obvious center, a system without a clear hierarchy. It feels incomplete, as if we are seeing only one fragment of a much larger structure that has otherwise vanished. There are ruins that collapse into silence, and there are ruins that survive by accident. San Bartolo is neither. This is a place where an entire civilization painted its understanding of the universe, and then deliberately buried it. Not destroyed, not erased, preserved sealed beneath layers of stone as if it was never meant to be seen again. What was hidden here is not just art, it is a complete cosmology, a narrative of creation, power, and divine authority painted more than 2,000 years ago. And the deeper archaeologists look, the clearer one unsettling possibility becomes. The Maya may have understood their world far earlier and far more completely than history ever allowed. Deep within the dense jungles of northeastern Guatemala, in the remote Petén Basin, lies the ancient site of San Bartolo. Today, it is a quiet, overgrown ruin, far removed from the monumental cities that define the later Maya world. No towering temples dominate the skyline, no vast plazas draw attention. On the surface, it appears unremarkable. That illusion ended in 2001. Archaeologist William Saturno was not searching for a masterpiece. He was investigating looters' tunnels, narrow, unstable passages carved illegally into ancient structures. Inside one such tunnel, Cut into a pyramid known as Las Pinturas, a faint trace of red pigment appeared on a wall. It was the kind of detail easily overlooked. A stain, a fragment. But as light revealed more of the surface, it became clear this was not random. It was a mural. What followed was not a traditional excavation, but a race against collapse. The tunnel threatened to destroy what it had exposed. Archaeologists worked in confined spaces, carefully stabilizing walls, uncovering layers inch by inch. And with each section revealed, a larger picture began to emerge, one that should not have existed, at least not at this point in time. Before San Bartolo, the prevailing assumption about Maya civilization was structured around a gradual evolution. Complex writing, refined artistic systems, and fully developed cosmology were believed to emerge later, during the Classic period. San Bartolo shattered that assumption. The murals, dated to around 100 BCE, reveal a level of symbolic sophistication that appears fully formed. There is no sense of experimentation, no crude beginnings. The imagery is deliberate, structured, and coherent, suggesting that the ideas behind it had already existed for generations, perhaps centuries. At the center of this narrative is a figure that would later dominate Maya mythology, the maize god. Around him unfolds a sequence of scenes that echo the creation stories later recorded in the Popol Vuh, a sacred text written down over 1,000 years later. Here, however, the story is not written, it is painted, and it is older than anyone expected. This raises a fundamental question. If these ideas were already complete at San Bartolo, where did they come from? And how far back does that intellectual lineage extend? The murals themselves are technically extraordinary. Pigments of red, black, yellow, and white remain visible after more than 2 millennia, applied onto finely prepared plaster surfaces. The lines are controlled and precise. Figures are rendered with proportional accuracy and stylistic consistency that rival much later works. This is not primitive art. It is the product of a mature tradition. The scenes are arranged as a continuous narrative across the walls of a chamber. They depict ritual actions, mythological figures, and symbolic landscapes, each element contributing to a larger cosmological framework. Among the most striking images are depictions of rulers performing bloodletting rituals. In Maya belief, blood was not merely a biological substance. It was a conduit between the human and the divine. Through sacrifice, rulers did not simply demonstrate power, they activated it, sustaining the balance of the universe. This connection between kingship and cosmic order is not implied. It is explicitly constructed within the imagery. The ruler stands not outside the system, but within it both participant and essential mechanism. Equally revealing is the architecture surrounding the murals. The chamber in which they were painted was not left exposed. Instead, it was encased within subsequent construction phases. New layers of architecture were built directly over the old, sealing the murals inside. This was not destruction. The murals were not defaced or dismantled. They were entombed intact. The decision to bury the murals is perhaps the most enigmatic aspect of the site. Across the Maya world, it is not uncommon to find older structures incorporated into newer ones. Temples were often expanded, rebuilt, or reoriented. But the level of preservation at San Bartolo suggests something more deliberate. One interpretation frames this as a form of ritual renewal. By enclosing earlier sacred spaces within new construction, the Maya may have been symbolically preserving and renewing their connection to the past. The act of building over was not an erasure, but a continuation, a physical manifestation of cyclical time. Another possibility is more unsettling. The murals may have been intentionally hidden, not to protect them from destruction, but to restrict access. If the imagery represented knowledge considered sacred or even dangerous, then burying it would ensure its preservation while removing it from public view. The knowledge would remain, but only in a controlled, inaccessible form. There is also the question of origin. The sophistication of the murals implies a long developmental history that is not yet visible in the archaeological record. San Bartolo does not appear as a beginning. It appears as a continuation of something already advanced. Where, then, are the earlier stages? Have they been lost, destroyed, or simply not yet found? Even the process of discovery adds another layer of ambiguity. The murals were revealed not through planned excavation, but through the destructive activity of looters. Without that intrusion, they might still be hidden, sealed within the pyramid, unknown to modern science. This raises a final, more philosophical question. How much of ancient history remains hidden not because it was lost, but because it was intentionally concealed? Baekje gilt bronze. Incense burner is not a ritual object. It is an entire cosmology, engineered into a single piece of metal. At first glance, it appears to be a ceremonial vessel from an ancient kingdom, but the longer it is studied, the more it begins to resemble something else entirely, a compressed model of a universe, where mountains, animals, humans, and unseen forces are arranged with deliberate precision. It does not merely hold incense. It stages a controlled environment where smoke becomes movement and movement becomes meaning. The question is not why it was made, but how such a complex synthesis of art, engineering, and philosophy emerged with no clear developmental trail. The artifact dates to the 7th century, during the final decades of the ancient Korean kingdom of Baekje. It was discovered in 1993 at the Nyungsanri temple site, a location tied to royal ritual and religious activity rather than burial. This detail alone is critical. Unlike many extraordinary objects of antiquity that are found sealed within tombs, this incense burner was recovered from an active ceremonial environment. It was not meant to be hidden. It was meant to be used, seen, and understood, at least by those who possessed the knowledge to interpret it. The site itself was part of the last capital region of Baekje. Uncovered after systematic excavation, revealed foundations of temple structures, stone platforms, and ritual debris. Among these remains, the burner emerged intact, its surface still bearing the gold that once caught the light of fire and smoke. Physically, the object is structured in 3 distinct layers, each carrying symbolic weight. At its base, a dragon rears upward, its body coiled in tension as it supports the entire structure. This is not a decorative flourish. The dragon is positioned as a mediator between realms, earth below, sky above, and the fluid boundary between them. Above it sits the bowl, shaped not as a simple container but as a stylized landscape, with subtle undulations that suggest water or a sacred basin. Rising from this is the lid, a densely populated mountain form unlike anything else from the period. Over 70 miniature figures occupy its surface. Hunters poised mid-motion, musicians frozen in performance, animals navigating slopes and ridges, and solitary figures placed in positions that imply ritual or contemplation. The entire composition has been linked to the mythological Mount Penglai of Taoism, a legendary island mountain said to be the dwelling place of immortals. But here, it is not painted or described. It is constructed. The central mystery lies in how these elements function together. When incense is burned within the bowl, smoke rises through carefully placed perforations in the lid. These openings are not random. They are engineered pathways that guide the smoke through the internal structure, allowing it to emerge gradually across the mountain surface. The result is a controlled visual effect, smoke drifting across peaks like clouds, wrapping around figures, dissolving into the air in a way that mimics natural atmospheric movement. This transforms the object from a static artifact into a dynamic system. It is not simply representing a sacred mountain, it is simulating one. From an archaeological and technical perspective, the level of craftsmanship presents a serious anomaly. The burner is made of gilt bronze, requiring a multi-stage process involving casting, surface finishing, and gold application. Each miniature figure, some only millimeters in size, retains clear anatomical definition and spatial coherence. There are no visible distortions that would typically result from high-temperature casting at this scale. The integration between the hollow interior and the external sculptural detail suggests an advanced understanding of airflow, heat distribution, and structural stability. Yet there is no evidence of intermediate prototypes or developmental forms leading up to this object. It appears in the archaeological record fully realized. Excavations at the site and comparative studies across Baekje artifacts reveal a culture deeply connected to both Chinese culture and Buddhism, yet capable of producing distinct interpretations of these influences. Elements of Taoist cosmology are evident in the mountain motif, while the presence of human figures in ritualistic or meditative poses suggests Buddhist integration. Rather than a simple adoption of external ideas, the burner represents a synthesis, one that compresses multiple philosophical systems into a single physical object. This raises the possibility that Baekje artisans were not merely craftsmen, but participants in a broader intellectual framework that has only partially survived. Several unresolved questions continue to surround the artifact. Its exact function remains debated. While it is widely identified as an incense burner, its complexity exceeds that of typical ritual tools. Was it used in standard ceremonies, or reserved for highly specific rites involving symbolic reenactments of cosmological concepts? The absence of inscriptions leaves its intended meaning open to interpretation. The identity of its creators is equally unclear. No records attribute its construction to a known workshop or individual, and no other object from the same period matches its level of integration between form and function. The Tomb of the Red Queen is one of the most unsettling discoveries ever made in the Maya world, not because of what was found, but because of what was missing. A woman of immense power, buried with the full weight of royal ritual, placed beside one of the greatest kings of the classic Maya. And yet, her name does not exist. Deep beneath the structures of Palenque, a city that flourished at its peak between the 6th and 8th centuries, lies Temple 13th, a modest structure overshadowed by the monumental tomb of Kinich Janab Pakal. For decades, this temple remained largely ignored, its interior sealed and silent. That changed in 1994, when Mexican archaeologist Arnoldo González Cruz initiated an excavation that would uncover one of the most enigmatic burials in Mesoamerican archaeology. The entrance to the chamber had been intentionally blocked. Stones sealed the passageway, preserving a closed environment for over 13 centuries. When the final barrier was removed, the space inside appeared untouched. At its center lay a massive limestone sarcophagus. But it was not gold or carved inscriptions that defined the moment of discovery. It was color. Everything was red. The sarcophagus lid, the skeletal remains within. The surrounding surfaces all were coated in a dense layer of cinnabar, a mercury sulfide mineral known for its deep crimson hue. This was not incidental staining. It was deliberate, excessive, and absolute. The body had been transformed into a monochrome symbol, as if reduced to a single idea: blood, life, and perhaps something beyond death. Inside the sarcophagus, the remains of a woman were found, estimated to have died in her middle age. Her bones were fragile, but her burial was not. She wore a funerary mask crafted from jade, a material more valuable to the Maya than gold itself. Around her were necklaces, earrings, and ornaments of finely worked jadeite. The level of craftsmanship and the quantity of precious materials placed her unmistakably within the highest stratum of Maya society. This was not a noble. This was royalty. Yet there was no inscription naming her. This absence is the central mystery. In a civilization known for its detailed hieroglyphic records, where rulers commissioned elaborate texts to immortalize their identities and achievements, the silence surrounding this woman is striking. She was buried with the same ceremonial intensity as a king, positioned within meters of Pakal's own tomb, and yet denied the one thing the Maya valued most in death: remembrance through writing. One prevailing hypothesis suggests that she may have been Sakbu Ajar, the consort of Pakal. The proximity of the tombs supports this idea, as does the scale of the burial. Chemical analysis of her bones has indicated a diet consistent with elite Maya individuals, and her age at death aligns with what is known of the queen. However, no direct epigraphic evidence confirms this identification. Without inscriptions, the connection remains speculative. The use of cinnabar introduces another layer of complexity. This mineral was not only rare but also toxic. Its acquisition required access to specific geological sources, and its application in such volume suggests a ritual of exceptional importance. In Mesoamerican belief systems, red was closely associated with blood and vitality. Covering the dead in cinnabar may have symbolized a form of rebirth, a transition into another state of existence. But why was this woman subjected to such an extreme version of the practice? Archaeological evidence within the chamber reveals further intentionality. The tomb was not simply a place of deposition. It was engineered. The sealed environment preserved organic traces and maintained the integrity of the cinnabar coating. The sarcophagus itself was carefully constructed and positioned, indicating a planned burial rather than an improvised one. This was a controlled, deliberate act of commemoration, and yet the identity remains unresolved. This contradiction, maximum ritual, minimal record, is what defines the tomb of the Red Queen. Every physical element of the burial speaks of importance: the location, the materials, the treatment of the body. But the absence of a name disrupts the narrative. It forces a question that archaeology cannot easily answer. Was this anonymity intentional? One possibility is political erasure. In many ancient societies, individuals could be removed from official records due to shifts in power or internal conflict. If the woman buried here held influence that later became inconvenient, her name may have been deliberately omitted or destroyed. Another theory suggests that her identity was understood within a context now lost to us, perhaps encoded in symbols or traditions that have not survived. There is also the possibility that the mystery is not an absence, but a misinterpretation, that the clues to her identity exist, but remain unrecognized within the broader corpus of Maya inscriptions. Without a direct textual link, however, such interpretations remain uncertain. What is certain is this: the tomb of the Red Queen represents a paradox. It is one of the most complete and well-preserved royal burials in the Maya world, yet it lacks the single element that would make it fully understood. It is a monument to a person whose life was considered significant enough to warrant extraordinary treatment in death, but not significant enough or not permitted to be named. In the end, the chamber beneath Temple 13 does not offer resolution. It offers a controlled environment of silence, preserved as carefully as the body it contains. The red dust remains, settled over bone and stone, unchanged for over 1,000 years. It marks a presence that was once undeniable, and a memory that was never allowed to fully form. And somewhere within that contradiction lies the true mystery. Not who the Red Queen was, but why a civilization so obsessed with recording identity chose, in this case, to leave it behind. Chumash Painted Cave is not a gallery of ancient art. It is a record of something far more elusive, an attempt to map experiences that occur beyond ordinary perception. The figures covering its ceiling and walls do not depict animals, battles, or daily life. Instead, they form an abstract language of circles, grids, and spiraling forms that feel less like observation and more like transmission. Whoever painted this cave was not documenting the world outside. They were recording something happening inside the human mind, something we still struggle to understand. Hidden in the rugged hills above Santa Barbara, California, The cave belongs to the cultural sphere of the Chumash, a coastal people whose history in the region stretches back thousands of years. Unlike vast cave systems found elsewhere in the world, this site is small little more than a rock overhang. Yet within that confined space lies an extraordinary density of imagery, layered across the stone like overlapping thoughts preserved in mineral form. The cave was known to local indigenous communities long before outsiders encountered it. By the 19th century, it had entered written records, but not without consequence. Early visitors, lacking context, sometimes altered or damaged portions of the artwork. What remains today is both a fragment and a survivor protected now, but carrying the marks of time, weather, and human interference. Dating the paintings precisely has proven difficult. There are no clear organic materials to analyze, and the images themselves may have been created across multiple generations. Some are believed to be several hundred years old, while others may trace back even further. Rather than a single moment in time, the cave appears to represent a continuity of use, a place revisited, reinterpreted, and repainted across centuries. What makes Chumash Painted Cave extraordinary is not just its age, but the nature of its imagery. Unlike many prehistoric sites that depict animals or hunting scenes, the compositions here are overwhelmingly abstract. Concentric circles radiate outward like ripples. Zigzagging lines cut across the surface with deliberate intensity. Complex grids and interwoven patterns seem to pulse with internal structure. These forms are strikingly consistent with what modern neuroscience describes as entoptic phenomena, visual patterns generated by the human brain under specific conditions. When individuals enter altered states of consciousness through ritual, sensory deprivation, or psychoactive substances, they often report seeing geometric shapes nearly identical to those found in the cave. This raises a possibility that transforms the site from an artistic space into something far more complex. The cave may not be a place of decoration, but of experience. A place where individuals sought to cross a threshold, to enter a different state of awareness, and then attempted to preserve what they encountered there. In this interpretation, the cave becomes a bridge between worlds, not physical worlds, but perceptual ones. The paintings are not representations, they are traces. Scientific analysis of the pigments reveals that the artists used natural mineral sources, iron oxides for reds, charcoal for blacks, and clay-based materials for whites. These substances were carefully prepared and applied, sometimes layered, sometimes renewed. Despite exposure to the elements, many of the images remain vivid, suggesting a level of technical understanding that goes beyond simple application. Yet the evidence is as notable for what it lacks as for what it reveals. There are no clear tools, no written records, no definitive timeline. The cave resists conventional excavation. Its significance lies not in buried artifacts, but in the images themselves, which cannot be removed, replicated, or fully decoded. Ethnographic studies of the Chumash people provide additional context. Historical accounts describe the use of ritual practices involving plants, such as datura, known to induce powerful visions. These ceremonies were often led by individuals occupying specialized spiritual roles, figures who mediated between the physical and the unseen. While direct links cannot be proven, the parallels between these accounts and the imagery within the cave are difficult to ignore. Even with modern frameworks, the cave remains unresolved. If the images reflect altered states of consciousness, why were they created in this specific location? The cave itself is not particularly deep or hidden. It is accessible, exposed, almost deliberately positioned between concealment and visibility. This suggests it may have functioned as a shared space, perhaps a site of initiation, or a place where experiences were not only had, but witnessed. Another question lies in the layering of the paintings. Some designs overlap others, creating a visual palimpsest. This implies continuity, but not necessarily consistency. Did each generation interpret the experience differently? Were the symbols fixed in meaning, or did they evolve over time? There is also the matter of incompleteness. Portions of the cave have been lost through erosion, vandalism, and simple passage of time. What we see today may be only a fraction of the original composition. Entire sections of meaning may have disappeared, leaving behind a puzzle with missing pieces. Perhaps the most compelling mystery is conceptual. If these images truly represent internal human experiences, then they challenge a fundamental boundary in archaeology. Most ancient sites tell us how people lived, what they built, what they ate. Chumash painted cave may instead reveal how they perceived, how they navigated the architecture of their own minds. Gunung Padang is not just a hill. It is a question carved into the landscape of Indonesia, one that challenges the very timeline of human civilization. Rising quietly above the forests of West Java, it looks, at first glance, like a natural formation shaped by volcanic forces. But beneath its surface, hidden under layers of earth and time, lies a possibility that unsettles everything we think we know, that this hill may in fact be a structure, one that predates the oldest known monuments on Earth. Located in the Cianjur Regency of West Java, Gunung Padang sits approximately 885 meters above sea level, surrounded by dense vegetation and mist-covered ridgelines. At its summit, the terrain transforms into a series of 5 distinct terraces, each constructed from tightly arranged columns of volcanic basalt. These stones, naturally formed into hexagonal pillars through ancient cooling processes, have been deliberately stacked, aligned, and organized into walls, platforms, and pathways. The top terrace alone spans nearly 900 square meters, forming a geometric plateau that feels unmistakably intentional. The site was first documented in 1890 by Dutch colonial researchers, who noted the unusual arrangement of stones but did not fully grasp its significance. For decades, Gunung Padang was classified as a megalithic site, assumed to be no more than 2,000 to 3,000 years old, similar to other ancient ritual complexes in Southeast Asia. But that interpretation would begin to unravel in the early 21st century, when a new wave of investigation approached the hill not as a surface ruin, but as something far deeper. In 2011, a research team led by Indonesian geologist Danny Hilman Natawijaja initiated a series of subsurface studies using modern geophysical tools. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography, and core drilling were employed to look beneath the visible terraces. What they found was not a simple hill, but a complex layered structure extending deep below the surface. The data suggested multiple construction phases, each buried beneath the next, forming a vertical timeline of activity that stretched far beyond conventional expectations. At the heart of the mystery is the claim that Gunung Padang is not merely built upon a natural hill, but that the hill itself has been engineered. According to the team's findings, the uppermost layer corresponds to the known megalithic terraces, dated to approximately 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Beneath this lies a second layer, consisting of compacted arrangements of basalt blocks, estimated to be between 7,500 and 8,300 years old, and deeper still, at depths exceeding 15 meters, are formations that may date back as far as 20,000 years. If these dates are accurate, they would place the earliest phase of Gunung Padang long before the rise of agriculture, before cities, before writing at a time when humans are believed to have lived as small, nomadic groups. It would make the site significantly older than the Great Pyramid of Giza and potentially the oldest large-scale construction ever discovered. But this is precisely where the controversy begins. The archaeological evidence is both compelling and deeply contested. Core samples extracted from various depths have revealed fragments of organic material which were subjected to radiocarbon dating. These results produced the surprisingly ancient dates that underpin the theory of a multi-layered, prehistoric structure. In addition, geophysical scans have identified anomalies within the hill zones of differing density linear features and voids that resemble chambers or corridors. These internal cavities suggest the possibility of enclosed spaces, intentionally created and later buried. Yet critics argue that these findings may be misinterpreted. Many geologists maintain that the deeper layers are natural formations, shaped by volcanic activity and subsequent weathering. The presence of organic material, they suggest, does not necessarily indicate human construction. It could have been introduced through natural processes such as root infiltration or sediment mixing. The apparent structures detected by radar may simply be irregularities in the rock, not evidence of engineered design. In this view, Gunung Padang remains a fascinating but ultimately conventional site, a natural hill modified at the top by a later culture. And still, the questions persist. Why are the basalt columns at the surface so precisely arranged, forming straight lines, right angles, and repeating patterns? Why do some of these columns appear to be embedded vertically, as if anchored into place, rather than scattered randomly as one would expect from natural deposition? And if the deeper layers are indeed natural, why do they exhibit characteristics that mimic human construction? Layering, alignment, and compartmentalization. One of the most intriguing aspects of Gunung Padang is the suggestion of buried chambers. Seismic data has pointed to hollow spaces within the hill, though their exact size and shape remain unclear. Attempts to excavate these areas have been limited, partly due to the complexity of the terrain and partly because of ongoing debates within the scientific community. If such chambers exist, they could hold artifacts, inscriptions, or structural features that would definitively clarify the site's origins. But for now, they remain sealed, inaccessible, and speculative. Local traditions add another layer to the mystery. For centuries, the people of the region have regarded Gunung Padang as a sacred place, associated with ancient legends and spiritual significance. The name itself is often translated as Mountain of Enlightenment, hinting at a deeper cultural memory tied to the site. While such narratives cannot be taken as historical evidence, they suggest that the hill has long been perceived as something more than ordinary. What makes Gunung Padang so compelling is not just the possibility that it is ancient, but the scale of what it implies. If even part of the controversial dating is correct, then it forces a reconsideration of human capability in deep prehistory. It raises the possibility that organized construction, large-scale engineering, and complex planning may have existed far earlier than currently accepted, not as isolated anomalies, but as expressions of cultures we have yet to fully understand. But it also serves as a cautionary case. The interpretation of data, especially when it challenges established frameworks, requires extraordinary scrutiny. Gunung Padang sits at the intersection of evidence and expectation, where new discoveries collide with long-held assumptions. It is a place where the line between natural and artificial becomes blurred, and where each new finding seems to deepen the uncertainty rather than resolve it. Tepe Hissar is not a ruin. It is a record of time itself, compressed, buried, and forgotten beneath a single rising mound in the Iranian plateau. Long before empires carved their names into stone, long before history was written, this place was already alive. And then, without leaving behind a single word, it vanished. Located near the ancient city of Damgan in northern Iran, Tepe Hissar appears unremarkable at first glance, a low, dusty mound, shaped by wind and centuries of neglect. But beneath its surface lies something far more unsettling, a continuous record of human life stretching back over 4,000 years. This is not a city frozen in a single moment of destruction. It is something far rarer. It is a place where generations built upon the remains of the dead, where entire cultures rose, evolved, and disappeared layer by layer without ever knowing they were becoming history. The site first drew serious archaeological attention in the early 20th century, when excavations led by Eric Schmidt in the 1930s began to peel back its surface. What he uncovered was not a single civilization, but a sequence. 3 distinct cultural phases now known as Hissar 1, 2, and 3, each separated by subtle but undeniable shifts in technology, behavior, and belief. Together, they form a timeline of transformation, from early agrarian life to a society capable of metallurgy, trade, and social hierarchy. But the deeper the excavations went, the more unsettling the pattern became. The earliest layer, Hissar 1, dates back to a time when human communities were still bound to the rhythms of agriculture. The tools were simple. The pottery was handmade, often uneven, marked by geometric designs that seemed more symbolic than decorative. There was no metal, no evidence of large-scale organization, no sign of hierarchy. It was a world that felt close to the beginning, fragile, experimental, and local. Then, without warning, something changed. In the layers above, Hissar 2 reveals the first appearance of copper, not crude fragments, but shaped objects, tools, and ornaments that required knowledge, precision, and control over fire and material. Metallurgy did not evolve slowly here. It appeared, fully formed, integrated into daily life, and with it came refinement. Pottery became more intricate, designs more deliberate, and objects more specialized. This was no longer a purely agrarian settlement. It was connected to ideas, to resources, perhaps to distant cultures. And then came Hissar III. The final phase is where Tepe Hissar becomes truly enigmatic. Burials from this period tell a story that the living never wrote. Some individuals were laid to rest with remarkable wealth. Finely crafted weapons, polished ornaments, objects made from materials not native to the region. Others were buried with almost nothing. The difference is stark, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. This was no longer a community of equals. It was a society divided, structured, hierarchical, and aware of status, even in death. Weapons appear in greater numbers. Blades, axes, and spearheads crafted from bronze suggest not only technological advancement, but conflict. Some skeletal remains bear marks of trauma fractures, cuts, signs of violence that were healed or fatal. Tepe Hissar, it seems, was not a peaceful progression of human development. It was a place where tension existed, where power may have been contested, where survival was not guaranteed. And yet, for all its advancement, all its complexity, the most important question remains unanswered. Why did it end? Around 1900 BCE, the site was abandoned, not destroyed in a clear act of war, not buried beneath a visible catastrophe, but simply left behind. The people disappeared, the structures decayed, and over time, the wind and sand erased the surface, sealing everything beneath layers of silence. There is no written record, no inscription, no tablet, no trace of explanation. Only objects remain mute, fragmented, and open to interpretation. Modern archaeology has returned to Tepe Hissar with tools far beyond what early excavators possessed. Scientific analysis of materials, isotopic studies, and even genetic research have begun to reconstruct fragments of the lives once lived here. Evidence suggests that this settlement was not isolated. Materials found in the upper layers point to long-distance exchange networks, linking Tepe Hissar to regions far beyond its immediate geography. This was a node, a point of contact between cultures, technologies, and ideas, which only deepens the mystery. If Tepe Hissar was connected, if it was thriving, if it had developed metallurgy, trade, and social structure, then its disappearance becomes harder to explain, not easier. Collapse is expected in fragile systems. But this was not fragile. This was a society that had already adapted, evolved, and endured for centuries. Some theories suggest environmental change, a shift in climate that made the region less sustainable. Others point toward conflict, either internal or external, that may have destabilized the population. There are suggestions of economic decline, of trade routes shifting, of a slow unraveling rather than a sudden fall, but none of these explanations fully account for what is missing. There is no transitional layer showing decline, no clear evidence of famine, no mass graves indicating a violent end. Instead, there is absence, a silence that begins abruptly and extends forward through time. Tepe Hissar does not tell us how ancient civilizations fell. It shows us something far more unsettling, that they can disappear without leaving behind a reason. There are ancient structures that survive in fragments, ruins worn down by time, their stories incomplete but still traceable. And then there are places like the Longyou Caves, a construction so vast, so deliberate, and so technically precise that it should have dominated the historical record, yet it didn't. No chronicles, no inscriptions, no names, just 1,000,000 cubic meters of missing stone and a silence that has lasted for over 2,000 years. The caves lie beneath the quiet countryside of Zhejiang province in eastern China, near the small village of Xianbeikun. For generations, locals believed the ponds scattered across the area were bottomless, their dark, still surfaces treated as natural features shaped only by time and folklore. In 1992, that assumption ended when a villager decided to drain one of these ponds. As the water level dropped, geometry began to emerge. Flat plains, angled surfaces, carved walls. When the pond was fully emptied, what stood revealed was not a natural cavern, but a colossal underground chamber, with a high ceiling, massive stone pillars, and walls bearing the unmistakable marks of human construction. That first chamber led to more discoveries, and eventually 24 separate caverns were identified, all carved into solid siltstone, all hidden beneath what once appeared to be ordinary water. From the moment they were uncovered, one question has defined the Longyou Caves: who built them, and why was it never recorded? Each cavern spans roughly 1,000 to 3,000 square meters, with ceilings rising up to 30 meters high, and the total volume of excavated stone exceeds 1,000,000 cubic meters. Even with conservative estimates, such a project would have required a massive workforce operating over years, if not decades. Yet within the extensive historical records of ancient China renowned for their detail and continuity, there is no mention of any such construction, not during the era of the Qin dynasty nor in later dynasties. This absence is not a simple gap in documentation. It is a contradiction, because projects far smaller in scale were carefully recorded with names, dates, and purposes, while Longyou, a project of immense magnitude, appears nowhere. Inside the caves, the evidence becomes even more perplexing. Every wall, every column, and every ceiling surface is covered in parallel chisel marks that run diagonally at an angle of roughly 60 degrees, forming a repeating pattern across thousands of square meters. At first glance, they resemble marks left by manual excavation, but their consistency raises deeper questions. The spacing is uniform, the depth is controlled, and there is no visible variation from one section to another. No area appears unfinished, corrected, or improvised. In typical quarrying, efficiency dictates rough and irregular surfaces, shaped only as needed to extract material. But Longyou is different. The walls are refined, almost deliberate in their uniformity, suggesting a purpose beyond simple extraction. Structurally, the caves also demonstrate a level of planning that goes beyond necessity, with pillars arranged in balanced formations to support the ceiling, and some chambers featuring stair-like structures, flat platforms, and internal divisions that imply intentional design. Yet despite these architectural elements, archaeologists have found almost no artifacts, no tools, no human remains, no clear evidence of habitation. Only a few carvings, simple depictions of animals such as birds, fish, and horses hint at human presence beyond the act of construction itself. The deeper one examines the Longyou Caves, the more the questions multiply. If they were quarries, where is the stone that was removed? And why does no nearby construction reflect such an immense output? If they were ritual spaces, where are the symbols, inscriptions, or cultural markers that define sacred architecture in other ancient sites? If they served as shelters or storage, why is there no trace of sustained human use, no residue of life, no tools, no organic remains? Even their preservation raises questions, as these vast chambers remain structurally stable for over 2,000 years, sealed beneath water without collapse, suggesting an advanced understanding of geology and engineering. And then there is the pattern itself, the repeating chisel marks that cover every surface. They serve no obvious structural function, do not reinforce the rock, and do not clearly aid in drainage or acoustics, yet they are applied with absolute consistency, as if their presence was essential to the design, a signature without a message. The Longyou Caves stand as one of the rare archaeological sites where scale, precision, and intention are undeniable, yet meaning remains completely absent. It is not simply that we do not know why they were built, it is that everything about them suggests we should. A project of this magnitude required planning, coordination, labor, and purpose. It should have belonged to a civilization, to a ruler, to a defined moment in history. Instead, it exists outside of all three, buried, forgotten, and revealed only by accident, not just a lost structure, but a construction that was never meant to be remembered. Tel es-Sultan is not where civilization began. It is where it was already fully formed, long before history was supposed to exist. More than 10,000 years ago, on the edge of the Jordan Valley near Jericho, a community emerged that should not have been possible for its time. This was not a scattered group of hunter-gatherers drifting across the landscape. It was a settlement with walls, architecture, and a sense of permanence appearing thousands of years before the rise of Egypt, Mesopotamia, or any known complex society. And yet, despite nearly a century of excavation, Tel es-Sultan remains less understood than the civilizations that came long after it. The site itself is a mound, a tell, built from the accumulated remains of repeated human occupation. Layer upon layer, civilization rose, collapsed, and rose again in the same place. Archaeological evidence suggests that the earliest settlement dates back to around 10,000 BCE, placing it firmly within the pre-pottery Neolithic period. At a time when most of humanity still lived in temporary shelters, the inhabitants of Tel es-Sultan were already constructing permanent dwellings, organizing communal labor, and reshaping the land around them. The location was no accident. A natural spring provided a reliable water source in an otherwise harsh environment, allowing continuous habitation across millennia. But geography alone does not explain what was built here. Among the most striking discoveries is a massive stone tower, rising approximately 8.5 meters in height, with a diameter of nearly 9 meters at its base. Inside, a narrow staircase of 22 steps spirals upward, carved with precision from stone. It is one of the earliest large-scale architectural structures ever discovered on Earth. Nearby, a substantial stone wall encircles the settlement, suggesting an organized effort to define and protect space. These constructions date to a period when metal tools had not yet been invented, when even basic technological advancements like the wheel were still thousands of years in the future. And yet, the people of Tel es-Sultan were quarrying, shaping, and transporting stone on a scale that implies coordination, planning, and a level of knowledge we struggle to attribute to societies of this era. This is where the core mystery begins. Why would a Neolithic community without clear evidence of large-scale warfare invest so much labor into building fortifications? The wall does not fit neatly into what we understand as defensive architecture. There are no signs of sustained conflict from this period, no widespread evidence of organized armies or external threats. Some researchers have proposed that the wall served as protection against flooding, a practical response to environmental conditions. Others suggest it may have had symbolic or social significance, a physical boundary marking identity and belonging. The tower itself complicates the question further. Its orientation has led some to speculate about astronomical alignments, hinting at a possible connection to early forms of timekeeping or ritual observation. But these interpretations remain speculative. There is no definitive answer, only a structure that should not exist, built for a purpose we cannot fully explain. Equally unsettling is what was found beneath the floors of the settlement's houses. Excavations revealed human skulls that had been deliberately modified after death. The craniums were preserved, while the facial features were reconstructed using plaster, with shells inserted into the eye sockets to create lifelike expressions. These were not random acts. The consistency of the practice suggests a structured ritual, possibly tied to ancestor veneration or beliefs about the afterlife. The dead were not simply buried and forgotten. They were transformed, curated, and kept within the living space. It is one of the earliest known examples of complex mortuary behavior, indicating that abstract thought, symbolic expression, and spiritual concepts were already deeply embedded in this society. The modern exploration of es-Sultan began in earnest during the early 20th century. In the 1930s, British archaeologist John Garstang conducted excavations that uncovered sections of the ancient wall and evidence of destruction layers. He interpreted these findings through the lens of historical narratives, suggesting a possible connection to later textual accounts. However, it was the work of Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s that fundamentally reshaped our understanding of the site. Using advanced stratigraphic methods, she demonstrated that the timeline of construction and destruction did not align with earlier assumptions. Her work revealed a far deeper antiquity, pushing the origins of the settlement back thousands of years and separating it from later historical frameworks. What emerged was not confirmation of known history, but the exposure of a much older, largely undocumented chapter of human development. The archaeological evidence at es-Sultan is both rich and frustrating. Pottery is absent in the earliest layers, yet architecture is present. Tools are simple, yet construction is complex. The society appears organized, but leaves behind no written language to explain itself. Over 20 distinct layers of occupation have been identified, each representing a different phase of habitation, destruction, and renewal. It is a vertical timeline of human persistence, compressed into a single geographic point. And yet, for all this data, the motivations behind what was built here remain elusive. Several unresolved questions continue to define the site. If the wall was not primarily defensive, what threat or idea justified its construction? If the tower was not purely functional, what role did it play in the lives of those who built it? Why did early humans, at such an early stage of societal development, engage in elaborate mortuary practices that suggest a sophisticated understanding of identity, memory, and death? And perhaps most fundamentally, how did a community at this stage achieve such a level of coordination without the systems we associate with complex civilization? No writing, no formal governance structures, no known technological advantages? es-Sultan forces a confrontation with our assumptions about the timeline of human progress. It suggests that the emergence of organized society, symbolic thought, and architectural ambition did not occur gradually in well-documented stages, but may have appeared in isolated bursts, in places and times we are only beginning to recognize. It is not simply an ancient site. It is a reminder that the origins of civilization are not as linear or as fully understood as we once believed. This armor should not exist in the Bronze Age, at a time when most warriors stepped into battle protected by little more than layered linen, stitched leather, and a round shield of wood. Someone built a full-body defensive system out of metal articulated, engineered, and shockingly complete. It did not resemble the fragmented gear of early warfare. It It resembled something far closer to a medieval knight's harness, appearing in history nearly 2,000 years too early. The deeper you look at it, the more unsettling the question becomes. Not how it was made, but why something this advanced ever existed and then disappeared. In 1960, archaeologists excavating a chamber tomb near Dendra uncovered what initially seemed like scattered sheets of corroded bronze. But as the fragments were cleaned, catalogued, and slowly reconstructed, a coherent form began to emerge. Plate by plate, curve by curve, the pieces aligned into something unmistakable. A complete suit of armor, not symbolic, not partial, not decorative fragments, but a functional, human-shaped defense system. This armor belonged to the world of the Mycenaean civilization, dated to around the 14th century BCE, and yet nothing else from that world. No surviving battlefield equipment, no visual record, no literary description matched its level of sophistication. The reconstructed armor revealed a design both simple and deeply complex. Large bronze plates covered the torso, front and back, shaped to follow the human body, while shoulder guards extended outward to protect the upper arms without fully sacrificing movement. A high, rigid neck guard enclosed the throat, one of the most vulnerable points in combat, and below, additional plates protected the lower torso and upper legs, forming a continuous barrier of metal. The entire structure was held together not by a single casting, but by a system of straps, hinges, and internal supports, creating a modular assembly that could be worn, adjusted, and potentially repaired. This was not a crude shell, it was engineered. Bronze, however, is not steel. It is softer, more prone to deformation, and significantly less forgiving under repeated stress. To transform it into thin, shaped plates without cracking requires precise control of heating, hammering, and cooling, because too much force fractures the metal, and too little leaves it structurally weak. Yet the plates of the Dendra armor were shaped with consistency, their thickness controlled, their curvature intentional, and their edges finished in a way that suggests both durability and an understanding of stress distribution. This implies more than skill. It implies a system of knowledge that understood not just how to shape metal, but how that metal would behave under impact. And yet, there is a paradox at the center of this design. The armor is protective, but restrictive. With an estimated weight between 15 and 18 kilograms, it is not impossibly heavy, but its rigidity limits, flexibility, its enclosed neck restricts vision, and its segmented lower plates constrain rapid movement. This is not the armor of a fast-moving infantryman, which leads to a critical question. Who was it designed for? One leading interpretation suggests that the armor was intended for a chariot warrior, because in Bronze Age warfare, chariots were platforms of mobility and dominance where a warrior did not need to run or pivot, but needed protection from arrows, thrown spears, and sudden impact. Within that context, the Dendra armor becomes not a limitation but an advantage, a moving fortress, a shielded presence elevated above the battlefield, capable of absorbing attacks that would otherwise be fatal. But there is another possibility, equally compelling. The armor was found in a tomb, carefully placed and preserved, not as discarded equipment, but as something of value, something symbolic. Was it ever used in combat, or was it a ceremonial object constructed not for war but for identity, a display of power, status, and technological mastery? If it was purely symbolic, then its complexity becomes even more difficult to explain, because symbolic objects rarely demand such precision in function. They imitate reality, they do not replicate it in full. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Dendra armor is not its existence but its isolation. After its creation, this level of full-body metallic protection does not continue. Later Greek warriors wore simpler gear, with linen armor becoming widespread lighter, more flexible, and far less technologically demanding. while metal armour did not vanish entirely but regressed in both coverage and complexity. Only in the medieval period, more than 2,000 years later, do we again see fully articulated plate armour emerge on a comparable scale, creating a discontinuity that feels less like evolution and more like interruption, a technological peak followed by disappearance. Why would such a design vanish? One explanation is practicality, because the armour may have been too expensive, too specialised, or too limiting for widespread use, and warfare evolves toward efficiency rather than maximum protection. A heavily armoured warrior who cannot manoeuvre becomes vulnerable in different ways. But another possibility remains, that the knowledge required to produce such armour was never widespread to begin with, existing only within a narrow group of craftsmen serving a narrow class of elites. And when that system collapsed, as many Bronze Age systems did, the knowledge collapsed with it, not lost in mystery but lost in silence. What makes the Dendra armour so compelling is not just its construction but its coherence. This was not an experiment or an incomplete prototype. Every component aligns with a clear purpose: protection of the vital body, distribution of weight, and controlled articulation. It suggests that whoever designed it understood exactly what they were building, and that raises a final, deeper question. If they understood it so well, why do we see so little evidence of others like it? The Dendra Panoply forces us to reconsider the world it came from. We often imagine the Bronze Age as technologically limited, constrained by material and method. But objects like this challenge that narrative by revealing pockets of innovation, moments where knowledge, need, and skill align to produce something that seems out of place in its own time. Not because it is impossible, but because it is rare. The armour from Dendra is not just a relic, it is a contradiction, a system that appears too early, disappears too completely, and leaves behind too few answers. It stands at the edge of what we understand about ancient warfare, metallurgy, and design, not as proof that history is wrong, but as evidence that it is incomplete, and somewhere between what we know and what we assume, there is still space for something like this to exist. Once a year, for only a few minutes, light enters a structure that was never meant to fail. It does not scatter randomly. It does not hesitate. It moves in a straight, deliberate path, crossing stone, crossing shadow, and reaching a chamber that has been waiting for it for thousands of years. There are no inscriptions explaining it, no written plans, no surviving instructions, and yet everything works. Not almost, not approximately, exactly. Clava Cairns lies just outside Inverness, in the Scottish Highlands, a quiet field that at first glance looks like a scattering of ancient stones. The site, often referred to as the Balnuran of Clava, was formally documented and studied in the 19th century, though local awareness of the stones existed long before that. Excavations began in earnest in the early 20th century, particularly in 1933 when archaeologists started to uncover the internal structures of the cairns. What they found was not a random burial ground, but a carefully engineered complex. Radiocarbon dating places its construction around 2000 to 3000 BCE, over 4,000 years ago, during the Bronze Age. This places Clava Cairns in the same broad era as sites like Stonehenge, yet its design philosophy is fundamentally different, because Clava Cairns is not just about standing stones, it is about precision. The site is composed of three distinct types of structures: passage cairns, ring cairns, and standing stone circles. The passage cairns contain a narrow corridor leading into a central chamber, clearly funerary in nature, while the ring cairns are hollow circles of stone with no internal burial space, and surrounding both are standing stones arranged in perfect rings. This is where the first anomaly appears, because if the purpose was burial, then why construct elaborate ring cairns that contain nothing? And if the purpose was ritual, then why build passage graves with such controlled internal geometry? Clava Cairns does not follow a single function. It behaves more like a system one, where each structure plays a different role. The most striking feature of Clava Cairns reveals itself only once a year. During the winter solstice, at sunset, the light from the dying sun aligns perfectly with the entrance of certain passage cairns, and the beam travels down the narrow corridor and reaches the inner chamber. This is not symbolic, this is mechanical. The angle of the passage, the height of the entrance, the positioning of surrounding stones all must be calculated with extreme precision, because a deviation of even a few degrees would cause the light to miss entirely. Comparable alignments exist at Newgrange, where sunlight enters at sunrise, but Clava Cairns aligns with sunset, a far more difficult event to predict due to atmospheric distortion and horizon variation. And this raises a fundamental question. How did a Bronze Age society, without written astronomy, calculate solar movement with such accuracy? Closer examination reveals that nothing in Clava Cairns is accidental. The stones forming the outer circles are arranged in a deliberate gradient, with the largest stones positioned near the entrance of the cairns, and gradually decreasing in size as one moves around the circle, creating a directional bias that is subtle but undeniable. The structure is guiding movement, suggesting where to enter, where to stand, and where to look, resembling controlled spatial design in modern architecture that influences human perception and behavior. Yet here it exists without blueprints, without documentation, and without any known theoretical framework. The choice of stone adds another layer of complexity. Many of the cairns incorporate reddish sandstone in specific positions, often oriented toward the southwest, the direction of the winter solstice sunset, while other sections use grey stone. This is not due to availability, as these materials had to be transported from different locations, which implies intention, meaning colour is being used as a signal, possibly to mark direction, possibly to encode meaning, or possibly as part of a symbolic system that has no surviving key, making it a language without words. The ring cairns remain one of the most puzzling elements of the site, because they are carefully constructed, geometrically precise, and yet functionally empty, with no burial remains, no central chamber, and no clear purpose. In most ancient sites, effort correlates with function and labour is not wasted, but here significant labour has been invested into something that appears to do nothing, unless its purpose was never physical, unless it was meant to define space rather than occupy it. Sites like Karnak stones demonstrate large-scale alignment systems, while Skara Brae reveals daily life in remarkable detail. But Clava Cairns fits neither category, because it is not a settlement and not an obvious ceremonial axis like Stonehenge. Instead, it operates on a smaller scale with higher precision, suggesting a different priority, not visibility, but accuracy. Centuries after its construction, the region became inhabited by the Picts, an early historic people known for their carved symbols and distinct culture, and although some Pictish markings have been found near the area, there is no evidence that they understood the original purpose of Clava Cairns. This creates a discontinuity, a structure that survived physically but lost its meaning completely, a system that continued to function but no longer had users who understood it. Several interpretations have been proposed, including a burial complex aligned with solar cycles, a ritual site marking the transition between life and death, an early calendar system tracking seasonal change, or something more abstract, a symbolic architecture designed to encode cosmological beliefs. Each theory explains part of the site, but none explains all of it. At its core, Clava Cairns presents a technical challenge, because to construct a structure that interacts with solar movement requires repeated observation, long-term tracking, and the ability to translate that knowledge into physical form, which is not accidental knowledge but accumulated data. And yet there is no record of how that data was stored, transmitted, or applied. No diagrams, no tools, no intermediate steps, only the final result. Clava Cairns does not overwhelm with size. It does not dominate the landscape. Instead, it operates quietly, almost invisibly, until the moment it activates, a brief alignment, a controlled interaction between light and stone, a system that still works after thousands of years, and a question that remains unanswered. If this was not just a tomb, then what exactly was it designed to do? A city built almost entirely from fired clay should not survive for centuries in a tropical climate. Rain, humidity, plant roots, and time should have erased it layer by layer, leaving nothing but soil and fragments. Yet in the plains of East Java, the remains of a vast urban centre still stand, gates rising intact, foundations aligned in deliberate patterns, and water systems that continue to hold their form after more than 600 years. No cement, no steel reinforcement, no visible binding mortar. And still, the structure of the city refuses to disappear. This is not a ruin in the conventional sense. It is a system that once worked, engineered, planned, and executed at a scale that should have required knowledge we assume did not exist here. And the deeper archaeologists dig, the less complete the explanation becomes. Trowulan lies in East Java, Indonesia, spread across an area estimated to exceed 100 square kilometers. It is widely believed to have been the capital of the Majapahit Empire, a powerful maritime civilization that dominated much of Southeast Asia during the 14th and 15th centuries. Unlike monumental stone complexes such as Angkor Wat or Borobudur, Trowulan does not overwhelm with vertical scale. Its power is horizontal. The city spreads outward rather than upward, its remains embedded within farmland, villages, and layers of sediment. What makes this location extraordinary is not just its size, but its coherence. Scattered across the landscape are large ceremonial gates like Ringin Lawang and Bajang Ratu, water structures such as Candi Tikus, and the faint but persistent outlines of roads, reservoirs, and residential zones. These are not isolated monuments. They are fragments of a city that once functioned as a unified whole. European awareness of Trowulan began in the 19th century, during Dutch colonial surveys of Java. Early observers documented scattered brick structures and unusual mounds, but initially these were not understood as parts of a single urban system. It was not until the early 20th century that systematic archaeological efforts began to reveal the scale of the site. Excavations uncovered foundations arranged in patterns too regular to be accidental, canals that aligned with one another across long distances, and concentrations of artifacts indicating dense habitation. Among the most important pieces of evidence linking Trowulan to the Majapahit capital are descriptions found in the 14th century Javanese text Nagarakretagama, which describes a royal city with gates, courtyards, and water features that closely match what has been uncovered. Yet even with this textual support, the reconstruction remains incomplete. There is no surviving master plan, no central map, no definitive boundary. What archaeologists have instead is a growing collection of fragments that, when viewed together, suggest a city far more complex than initially assumed. At the heart of Trowulan lies a contradiction. The city was built primarily from red brick, an inherently vulnerable material in a tropical environment. Unlike stone, brick absorbs moisture, cracks under thermal stress, and degrades under biological growth. Without protective coatings or modern binding agents, its lifespan should be limited. And yet, many of Trowulan's structures remain sharply defined. Edges are intact, surfaces are smooth, alignments are precise. In some cases, bricks appear to have been fitted together with such accuracy that gaps are nearly invisible, even without mortar. This raises a fundamental question. How was a city of this scale constructed from a material that should not have endured, and why has it not completely collapsed? The answer is not found in a single discovery, but in a series of clues that point toward a level of material control and environmental adaptation that is still not fully understood. Excavations across Trowulan have revealed several key elements that define its technological mystery. First, the bricks themselves. Analysis shows that Majapahit bricks were often fired at high temperatures and manufactured with consistent dimensions. Some studies suggest the possible use of organic additives such as plant resins or sugars that may have enhanced durability or bonding at a microscopic level. While not equivalent to modern cement, these methods may have created a form of cohesion that has yet to be fully replicated or tested under controlled conditions. Second, the construction technique. Many structures show evidence of tight interlocking placement rather than reliance on thick binding layers. This implies careful shaping, alignment, and possibly post-placement finishing. The result is a structural stability that distributes stress across the entire form, rather than concentrating it in joints. Third, and perhaps most significant, is the hydraulic system. Excavations have uncovered canals, reservoirs, and water channels arranged in a coordinated network. At sites like Canditikus, stepped basins and inlet channels suggest controlled water flow rather than simple storage. Some channels appear designed to regulate pressure or redirect excess water during heavy rainfall. This is critical. In a tropical environment, water is the primary force of destruction. A city that manages water effectively can extend its lifespan dramatically. A city that does not will vanish. Trowulan appears to have been designed with this principle at its core. Archaeological work at Trowulan has progressed in phases, each adding detail but also complexity. Early 20th century excavations focused on monumental structures, revealing gates and temples that established the site's cultural importance. These discoveries confirmed Trowulan as more than a collection of ruins. It was a ceremonial and political centre. Mid-century research expanded outward, identifying residential areas, industrial zones, and evidence of craft production. Kilns, pottery fragments, and metalworking remains indicated a thriving urban economy. Late 20th and early 21st century studies began to shift toward landscape archaeology. Instead of focusing on individual structures, researchers examined spatial relationships, how roads connected to water systems, how settlements aligned with canals, and how the entire environment was modified to support urban life. Remote sensing and mapping technologies have since revealed patterns invisible at ground level. Linear features suggesting roads, rectangular depressions indicating reservoirs, and distribution patterns consistent with planned zoning. Yet, despite these advances, large portions of Trowulan remain unexcavated, buried beneath modern habitation and agricultural land. What has been uncovered may represent only a fraction of the original city. The evidence points toward a city that was not only large, but intelligently designed. Its builders understood materials, water, and spatial organization at a level that allowed the city to function and endure far beyond what would be expected. And yet, key pieces are missing. There is no definitive explanation for the binding method used in the brickwork, no complete reconstruction of the hydraulic system, no surviving documentation that explains how the city was planned or managed at scale. Even more striking, there is no clear account of its end. Unlike other ancient capitals that show evidence of destruction, invasion, or catastrophic collapse, Trowulan appears to have faded. Structures were abandoned, buried, and gradually absorbed into the landscape without a single defining event. Trowulan is not a mystery because it is unknown. It is a mystery because it is partially known. Enough has been uncovered to prove that a complex, engineered city existed here. Enough remains visible to demonstrate that its systems worked, but not enough survives to explain how all of it came together. a city built from fragile material that refuses to disappear. A hydraulic network that still hints at precision without revealing its full design. A capital of a powerful empire that left no final chapter. The deeper the excavation goes, the clearer the structures become, and the more incomplete the explanation feels. Water follows the simplest path. That is one of the oldest rules in nature. It flows downhill, it seeks efficiency, and over time it carves the most direct route possible through any landscape. But high in the Peruvian Andes, there is a channel that does the opposite. Instead of flowing straight, it twists. Instead of minimizing distance, it stretches itself into deliberate detours. Instead of following natural erosion, it cuts through solid volcanic rock with sharp, unnatural precision. This is not how water behaves. And yet, for over 3,000 years it has worked. The Cumbemayo Aqueduct does not just move water. It challenges the very logic of how water systems are supposed to be built. And the deeper researchers look into it, the more unsettling the question becomes. Was this really just an aqueduct, or something far more complex? Cumbemayo lies roughly 20 kilometers southwest of the modern city of Cajamarca in northern Peru, at an altitude of around 3,500 meters above sea level. The environment is harsh, defined by thin air, jagged volcanic rock formations, and a landscape shaped by extreme weather. Towering stone pillars, often described as a stone forest, surround the site, creating a maze of eroded rock spires that seem almost unnatural in their density. This is not a place where large-scale engineering should have been easy, and yet carved directly into this terrain is a continuous stone channel stretching approximately 8 to 9 kilometers in length. It cuts across ridges, slices through bedrock, and navigates uneven elevation with a level of intentional design that appears anything but primitive. Even more striking is its position near a natural continental divide, where the canal effectively redirects water from one drainage basin to another, implying a level of hydrological understanding that goes far beyond simple survival needs and into deliberate environmental control. Unlike many ancient sites that were lost and later rediscovered, Cumbemayo was never entirely hidden. Local populations had always known of its existence, but systematic archaeological study did not begin until the 20th century, when researchers began documenting its structure, mapping its full extent, and attempting to understand its purpose. Early interpretations were simple and direct, classifying it as an aqueduct designed to transport water for agriculture or nearby communities. However, as surveys became more detailed, inconsistencies began to emerge. The layout did not follow efficiency-based engineering principles. The carvings appeared too precise for the assumed technological level of its builders, and perhaps most critically, there was no clear evidence of a large settlement nearby that would require such an extensive system. Radiocarbon dating and comparative archaeological analysis eventually placed its construction between roughly 1,500 and 1,000 BCE, long before the rise of the Inca civilization, shifting the narrative entirely. The builders were no longer part of a known empire with documented engineering practices, but instead belonged to a much earlier, less understood culture often associated with the Cajamarca region, making the sophistication of the canal even more difficult to explain. At the core of the mystery is the canal's design, which appears to deliberately contradict the natural behavior of water. Instead of following a direct route, the channel repeatedly shifts direction, forming sharp angles and zigzag patterns that force water to change direction abruptly. From a purely hydraulic perspective, this is inefficient, as a straight channel would minimize resistance and maintain a stable flow, while a zigzag path introduces turbulence and slows the movement. Yet this pattern is consistent throughout the system, suggesting intentional design rather than error or adaptation. One explanation proposes that these turns were used to control water velocity, reducing erosion and preventing damage to the channel over time. a theory that aligns with certain aspects of the structure but does not fully explain the precision of the angles or their repeated geometric consistency. Another interpretation suggests a ritual or symbolic function where water was not merely a resource but a sacred element integrated into spiritual practices, transforming the canal into a ceremonial pathway rather than a purely functional structure. There are also theories that the layout reflects environmental mapping or alignment with natural or celestial patterns, but none of these explanations fully resolve the central contradiction. Why construct a system that works by ignoring the simplest way it could function? Archaeological evidence further deepens the mystery. The channel is carved directly into volcanic rock, a material significantly harder than the types of stone typically used in many ancient constructions, yet the interior surfaces are often smooth and uniform, indicating controlled shaping rather than crude excavation. In multiple sections, the canal maintains consistent width and depth across long distances, implying not only technical skill, but also careful planning and an understanding of gradient that had to be maintained across kilometers of uneven terrain. Researchers have identified carved features that appear to regulate water movement, including narrowed passages, small basins, and transitional segments that may have functioned as primitive control systems. Surrounding the canal are numerous petroglyphs, depicting abstract patterns, animals, and possibly symbolic figures, suggesting that the site held cultural or spiritual significance beyond its apparent engineering purpose. Excavations in the broader area have revealed evidence of human activity dating back thousands of years, including tools, habitation traces, and ritual spaces, yet no definitive workshop sites or specialized tool remains have been discovered that clearly explain how such precise stone carving was achieved. This absence creates a critical gap between what was built and how it was constructed. Comparisons are often made to later Andean sites such as Ollantaytambo, where precision stonework is well documented, but those structures belong to a civilization with known organizational systems and advanced techniques, whereas Cumbemayo predates them by over a millennium, raising the possibility that this level of engineering was either an isolated achievement or evidence of a broader technological capability that has not yet been fully uncovered. Throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, multiple archaeological surveys have expanded our understanding of Cumbemayo without providing definitive answers. Detailed mapping has confirmed the full extent of the canal and its consistent gradient, while hydrological studies have demonstrated that despite its unconventional design, the system effectively transports water across the landscape. In other words, it works, but functionality alone does not explain intention. More recent research has attempted to integrate environmental analysis with cultural interpretation, examining how the canal interacts with seasonal rainfall, surrounding ecosystems, and possible ritual pathways, leading to the growing perspective that Cumbemayo may represent a hybrid system, combining infrastructure with ceremonial significance. This interpretation does not reduce the mystery but instead deepens it, suggesting that the builders were not simply solving a practical problem but creating something that operated on multiple levels simultaneously, blending physical engineering with symbolic meaning. Without written records, without clear evidence of the tools used, and without a fully understood cultural framework, the true purpose of Cumbemayo remains unresolved. The aqueduct stands as a contradiction carved in stone, precise yet unconventional, functional yet seemingly inefficient, ancient yet unexpectedly sophisticated, moving water across a mountain while forcing a question that still has no clear answer. What did its builders understand about the world that we have not yet rediscovered? A city that refuses to sit on the ground. Stone platforms rise where soil should have been enough, lifting entire living spaces above the earth as if the terrain itself was unacceptable. No mortar binds the walls. No written records explain the design, yet the structures endure precise, deliberate, and strangely unnecessary. Kami does not challenge what ancient builders were capable of. It challenges why they chose to build this way at all. The Kami ruins lie in southwestern Zimbabwe, near modern-day Bulawayo, within a dry savanna landscape cut by seasonal rivers. Unlike monumental sites placed on dramatic peaks or defensive ridges, Kami occupies terrain that, at first glance, does not demand architectural intervention. The land is usable. The soil is stable. There is no immediate environmental pressure forcing elevation. And yet, across this landscape, artificial terraces of stone rise in layers, forming platforms that reshape the natural topography. These are not minor adjustments. Some terraces extend for tens of meters, with retaining walls reaching heights of 6 meters or more. The environment did not require this transformation, but the builders imposed it anyway. Kami was already abandoned long before European explorers documented it in the 19th century. Early records from colonial observers described extensive stone ruins, but misunderstood their origins, often attributing them to foreign or mythical builders. It was not until systematic archaeological work in the 20th century that Kami was correctly linked to African civilizations, specifically the successor culture to Great Zimbabwe. Excavations revealed that Kami flourished roughly between the 15th and 17th centuries, associated with the Kingdom of Butua. Far from being an isolated anomaly, it represented a continuation and transformation of an already advanced architectural tradition. Yet even with this context, Kami introduced a new problem. If the builders inherited proven techniques from Great Zimbabwe, why abandon massive enclosures in favor of elevated platforms and segmented terraces? Kami's greatest mystery is not how it was built, but why its entire design philosophy diverges from expectation. The site is dominated by constructed terraces, artificial platforms built from carefully stacked stone retaining walls. On top of these platforms stood structures made of perishable materials, now vanished. What remains is the foundation system, a city defined not by its buildings, but by the surfaces those buildings once occupied. From an engineering perspective, this approach is inefficient. Constructing elevated platforms requires significantly more labor than building directly on level ground. It demands quarrying, transporting, and precisely placing thousands of stones, all without mortar. It also introduces structural risks. Retaining walls must resist pressure, erosion, and time. Yet Kami's terraces remain stable after centuries. This leads to a deeper contradiction. The builders clearly possessed the knowledge to construct durable structures with minimal effort evidenced by earlier sites. Instead, they chose a method that required more work, more planning, and more precision, without delivering obvious practical advantages such as defense or agriculture. The question becomes unavoidable. What purpose justifies rebuilding the ground itself? Excavations at Kami have revealed a layered and highly organized settlement, structured vertically rather than horizontally. The highest terraces are consistently associated with elite occupation. Artifacts recovered from these areas include imported goods such as Chinese porcelain and glass beads, indicating participation in long-distance trade networks extending across the Indian Ocean. Lower terraces, by contrast, show evidence of more ordinary domestic activity, with simpler ceramics and fewer luxury items. This vertical distribution suggests a clear social hierarchy embedded directly into the architecture. Status was not only lived, it was elevated, physically separating elites from the rest of the population. The stonework itself provides further insight. The retaining walls are constructed using dry stone techniques, where stones are carefully selected and placed without mortar. Despite this, the walls maintain remarkable stability. In some sections, decorative patterns such as herringbone and chevron designs are integrated into the structure. These patterns serve no structural function. They require additional effort and planning, implying that aesthetic or symbolic considerations were as important as engineering stability. The builders were not merely solving structural problems, they were communicating something through the stone itself. Comparisons with other terrace-based sites, such as Machu Picchu, highlight a crucial difference. In Inca contexts, terraces are optimized for agriculture, drainage, and erosion control. At Kami, there is no strong evidence that the terraces served such practical purposes. Their primary function appears to be spatial organization and social signaling. Early archaeological investigations in the mid-20th century focused on mapping the site and identifying its cultural context. These studies established Kami as part of the broader Zimbabwe tradition, confirming that its builders were indigenous and technologically sophisticated. Later excavations shifted toward detailed stratigraphic analysis. Researchers uncovered successive occupation layers, indicating that Kami was not built in a single phase but evolved over time. Terraces were expanded, modified, and reinforced, suggesting long-term planning and adaptation. One significant discovery was the extent of trade connections. Imported ceramics from China, dating to the Ming dynasty, were found alongside local artifacts. This provided concrete evidence that Kami was integrated into global trade systems, contradicting earlier assumptions that inland African sites were isolated. Further studies examined the engineering of the retaining walls. Analysis showed careful stone selection, with larger stones forming stable bases and smaller stones used to fill gaps and distribute pressure. The absence of mortar required precise placement, meaning that each stone contributed to overall stability through friction and weight distribution. Recent research has also explored the spatial logic of the site. Digital mapping and landscape analysis reveal that terraces were positioned with intentional relationships to one another, creating controlled movement pathways and visual hierarchies. Access to higher terraces was restricted, reinforcing social divisions. Despite decades of study, Kami resists a complete explanation. The engineering is understood, the materials are known, the cultural context is established. What remains unclear is the underlying logic that drove such an unusual architectural choice. Why invest enormous labor into elevating living spaces in an environment that did not require it? Why prioritize vertical separation over horizontal expansion? Why embed social hierarchy into the very ground people walked on? Kami suggests a society where architecture was not merely functional, but conceptual. The landscape was not accepted as given it was redesigned to reflect power, order, and meaning. They were never meant to look like this. Not in this time. Not with this level of detail. Faces carved into stone stare forward with blank precision eyes, noses, jawlines, and something far more unsettling: helmets, armor, and weapons. These are not abstract symbols. They are representations, records. But they appear in a place where, according to history, none of these things should exist yet. Because the deeper you look into Filitosa, the more one question begins to dominate everything else. Who were these stone warriors? And why does their existence contradict the timeline we trust? Filitosa lies on the southern part of the island of Corsica, a rugged landmass in the Mediterranean positioned between mainland Europe and the Italian peninsula, a geographic crossroads where maritime routes, migrating cultures, and emerging technologies could intersect. The site itself sits slightly inland, surrounded by rolling terrain and access to water systems, suggesting intentional placement rather than coincidence. Archaeological surveys indicate that Filitosa was occupied continuously from around 3300 BCE to roughly 1500 BCE, spanning the late Neolithic into the Bronze Age, and this continuity implies that Filitosa did not belong to a single culture, but was reused, reshaped, and possibly overwritten across generations. The modern rediscovery of Filitosa began in 1946, when a local landowner, Charles Antoine Cesari, noticed unusual standing stones scattered across his property, stones that at first resembled typical menhirs found across prehistoric Europe. However, as excavation began, what emerged was something entirely different, because by the 1950s, systematic digs had revealed not just stones, but carved figures, faces, bodies, structured forms that suggested intention rather than randomness. Even more striking was the context in which they were found. Many of these stones were not standing as originally placed. Some had been buried deliberately, while others had been reused as building material in later structures, indicating that this was not a site preserved by time, but one that had been actively altered by human hands. At the centre of Filitosa lies a contradiction that has never been fully resolved, because the carved statue menhirs depict what appear to be human figures equipped with defined facial features, helmets or headgear, chest armour, and bladed weapons resembling daggers or swords. Yet the earliest phases of the site date back to a time when metalworking was either non-existent or extremely limited, when societies were still largely dependent on stone-based tools, and when artistic expression was typically symbolic rather than representational at this level of detail. This creates a fracture in the historical model, because if these carvings are accurate representations, then either these societies had access to advanced forms of warfare and equipment earlier than we believe, or they were depicting something they had seen but did not fully understand, and both possibilities challenge the conventional timeline. Close analysis of the statue menhirs reveals a level of intentional design that goes far beyond primitive carving, because the faces are not random but follow a pattern in which eyes are symmetrically placed, noses are carved with consistent proportion, and jawlines are defined with deliberate angular cuts, while the supposed armour elements are not vague markings but structured forms showing horizontal banding across the chest, outlines resembling protective plating, and repeated motifs across multiple statues. This repetition suggests standardization, a shared visual language or template rather than isolated artistic expression. When compared to other prehistoric sites such as Göbekli Tepe, where carvings remain largely symbolic, Filitosa stands apart because here the carvings attempt to represent physical reality rather than abstract belief, and that shift from symbolic to representational is not expected to occur this early in human development. The earliest excavation phase in the 1950s to 1960s uncovered the primary statue menhirs, many of which were found damaged or incomplete, with a significant number showing signs of intentional breakage, particularly around the face and upper body, indicating not natural erosion but deliberate destruction. The second phase, during the 1970s to 1980s, revealed circular stone structures, often referred to as torii, constructed using reused materials including fragments of earlier statues, confirming a sequence in which the statues were created first and later societies destroyed and repurposed them, meaning that the creators and the destroyers were not the same people. In the third phase, spanning the late 20th century to the present, technological analysis of tool marks and carving techniques revealed that the carvings required controlled force and repeated precision strikes, with some grooves deeper and cleaner than expected from basic stone tools, and the consistency across statues suggesting trained craftsmanship, rather than random effort. Yet no clear evidence of advanced metal tools from the earliest layers has been confirmed, leaving a gap between the level of skill and the apparent technological capability. One of the most overlooked aspects of Filitosa is not what was built, but what was removed, because the damage patterns are consistent across the site, with faces targeted, upper sections broken, and fragments buried or reused, suggesting deliberate iconoclasm, the destruction of images for cultural or ideological reasons. This pattern is seen in other historical contexts, where invading or succeeding groups attempt to erase the identity of those who came before. But at Filitosa, the destruction appears more selective and controlled, not total annihilation but precise removal, as if specific elements were meant to disappear while others were left behind. Filitosa does not behave like a typical prehistoric site, but rather like a place where one culture created something highly specific. Another culture arrived, rejected it, and attempted to erase it, and in doing so unintentionally preserved fragments of a story that is no longer fully understood. The statues do not feel symbolic but observational, as if someone was trying to record what they saw: faces, equipment, presence. And if that is true, then the final question becomes unavoidable. Were these stone warriors imagined, or were they remembered? Long before the first pyramids rose above the Nile, before bronze tools reshaped human civilization, a silent geometry was already taking form in the western edge of Europe. Not a monument built for display, but a system arranged with intention. Stones placed not randomly, but with direction. Not once, but repeatedly adjusted, expanded, recalibrated over generations that left behind no written record of what they were trying to preserve. At first glance, it looks simple, a scattering of standing stones in a quiet forest. But the deeper you look, the more it begins to behave like something else entirely. Something structured, something measured, something that should not exist this early in human history. Because this site is older than Stonehenge, and yet, in certain ways, it is more complex. Hidden among cork oak forests just outside the city of Évora in southern Portugal, the Almendres Cromlech lies in a landscape that appears almost deliberately chosen. The terrain is gently elevated, with a wide, unobstructed horizon, an ideal vantage point for observing the sky. This is not a random placement. Across ancient cultures, sites aligned with celestial events tend to share one common trait: visibility. The sky must be seen clearly, consistently, and across long periods of time. Almendres fits that requirement with precision. The stones themselves, over 90 in total, are arranged across a sloping plateau, but unlike the perfect circle most people expect from megalithic sites, this arrangement forms overlapping elliptical patterns. The layout expands outward, suggesting not a single construction event, but a site that evolved over centuries, perhaps even millennia. And that alone raises a critical question. If this was built in stages, what knowledge was being preserved that required such continuity? For thousands of years, the stones remained largely unnoticed by the outside world, slowly blending into the natural environment. Covered by vegetation and soil shifts, their significance faded into obscurity. It was not until 1964 that Portuguese archaeologist Henrique Leonor Pina rediscovered the site during systematic surveys of the region. At the time, Portugal was beginning to reassess its prehistoric heritage, and Almendres quickly emerged as one of the most important Neolithic discoveries in Western Europe. Early documentation revealed the scale of the site, but its purpose remained unclear. Unlike tombs or settlements, there were no obvious signs of habitation, no domestic structures, no clear burial chambers within the main arrangement. What researchers found instead was something more puzzling, a space defined almost entirely by positioning. Subsequent archaeological campaigns throughout the 1970s and 1980s focused on mapping the stones, identifying phases of construction, and analysing their orientation. Radiocarbon dating of nearby organic material suggested that the earliest phases of the site date back to around 6000 to 5000 BCE, placing it firmly in the early Neolithic period. That timeline alone was enough to challenge existing assumptions. At that stage of human development, communities were only beginning to transition into agriculture, and yet here was a site requiring long-term planning, spatial awareness, and repeated construction efforts. The central mystery of Almendres is not simply how it was built, but why it was built this way. If this were a ceremonial gathering place, a simple circular arrangement would have sufficed. If it were a burial site, we would expect tomb structures, chambers, or grave goods integrated into the layout. But Almendres resists these straightforward explanations. Instead, it behaves like a system governed by alignment. Certain stones appear to correspond with the position of the rising sun during the winter solstice. Others suggest relationships with seasonal solar movement, though not in a perfectly symmetrical or easily decoded pattern. This is where the problem deepens. To track solar cycles with any degree of accuracy requires repeated observation over many years. The position of sunrise shifts gradually along the horizon throughout the year, reaching its extremes at the solstices. Recognizing this pattern is one thing. Encoding it into a physical structure is another. And yet, Almendres appears to do exactly that without any evidence of advanced measuring tools. There are no surviving instruments, no markings that clearly indicate a measurement system, no written records describing the intent, only stones, placed in positions that seem deliberate, yet remain partially beyond our ability to fully interpret. Even more puzzling is the fact that the site was not static. Archaeological analysis suggests multiple phases of expansion, with new stones added over time, subtly altering the geometry of the arrangement. This implies continuity of knowledge across generations, a transfer of understanding precise enough to maintain alignment, yet intangible enough to leave no trace of how it was taught or preserved. Excavations at Almendres have been relatively limited compared to more famous sites, but what has been uncovered provides critical insight into its function and development. Initial surveys focused on cataloguing each stone, its size, shape, and orientation. Many of the menhirs are composed of local granite, shaped only minimally, suggesting that their placement was more important than their refinement. However, closer inspection revealed something unexpected. Several stones bear engraved markings, simple yet intentional patterns consisting of circles, lines, and geometric forms. These carvings are not decorative in the traditional sense. They lack narrative imagery or symbolic complexity seen in later cultures. Instead, they appear abstract, possibly functional, possibly informational. In the late 20th century, more detailed spatial analysis began to reveal patterns in the arrangement. Researchers identified at least two major construction phases: an earlier, more compact grouping of stones, and a later expansion that extended the site outward into a larger elliptical configuration. This layered structure is significant. It suggests that the site was not abandoned after its initial construction, but actively maintained and modified. Further studies examine the orientation of individual stones relative to celestial events. While not all stones align perfectly, clusters of them appear to correspond with solar positions during key points in the year, particularly the winter solstice sunrise. Nearby, a separate standing stone, the menhir of Almendres, adds another layer to the system. Positioned along a natural pathway leading toward the main complex, it may have functioned as a reference point or marker, potentially guiding observers toward the correct viewing position for astronomical events. What is notably absent from all excavation layers is evidence of everyday life. There are no large accumulations of domestic artifacts, no signs of permanent settlement within the immediate vicinity of the cromlech itself. This absence reinforces the idea that Almendres was not a place people lived, but a place they returned to, repeatedly, for a purpose that required precision, memory, and consistency. Almendres Cromlech does not present itself as a mystery through grand scale or visual dominance. It does so through restraint, through subtlety, through a quiet persistence of patterns that resist simple explanation. It is a site built across time, aligned with cycles that extend beyond a single human lifetime, and maintained without any known system of recording knowledge. We can measure its stones, we can map its layout, we can approximate its age, but the system behind it, the logic that guided its construction, the method by which its alignments were preserved, the meaning behind its symbols remains incomplete. And perhaps that is what makes Almendres so compelling, not because it is beyond understanding, but because it suggests that something once understood has been lost. No walls, no temples, no inscriptions carved to explain anything. And yet, scattered across a quiet valley in southern Tanzania lies something far more unsettling than any lost city. Tens of thousands of stone tools carefully shaped, remarkably consistent, and seemingly mass-produced rest where no permanent human settlement ever existed. This is not a place that tells a story easily. It resists it, because the deeper you look at Isimila, the more it begins to resemble something that should not exist at this stage of human evolution. A production system without a society, a pattern without an explanation, and a level of precision that feels uncomfortably ahead of its time. What if this was not just a site of survival, but something closer to an ancient industry? The Isimila Stone Age site is located near the modern city of Iringa in Tanzania, carved into a landscape defined by dramatic sandstone pillars and deep erosion gullies. These towering formations, sculpted over tens of thousands of years by water and wind, create a terrain that feels almost artificial, like ruins of something far older than the tools scattered within it. Geologically, the region is composed of layered sediments deposited over hundreds of thousands of years. These layers hold within them the record of a distant past, one that dates back to the Acheulean period, roughly between 300,000 and 60,000 years ago. This was a time long before written language, long before cities, and long before any form of organized industry, at least, as we understand it. And yet, Isimila challenges that assumption. In 1951, the site was first brought to scientific attention by the British archaeologist F.W.H. Leakey. What initially appeared to be a standard Stone Age locality quickly revealed itself to be something far more significant. Excavations uncovered not just a handful of tools, but an overwhelming concentration of hand axes, cleavers, picks numbering in the tens of thousands. These were not random fragments. Many were complete, carefully shaped and preserved in astonishing detail. The sheer density of artifacts immediately set Isimila apart from other Acheulean sites across Africa and Eurasia. But what truly puzzled researchers was not just how many tools were found, but where they were found. There were no clear traces of long-term habitation, no hearths, no structured dwellings, no consistent evidence of daily life. It was as if tools had been produced here or deposited here on a massive scale, without the presence of the people who made them. The first and most immediate mystery is one of scale. In most Acheulean sites, archaeologists uncover hundreds, sometimes a few thousand tools at most. At Isimila, that number rises dramatically into the tens of thousands. This is not a marginal difference, it is an anomaly. Such a concentration implies repeated activity over long periods of time. But repeated activity suggests stability, and stability usually leaves behind evidence of settlement. At Isimila, that evidence is largely absent. This leads to a disturbing possibility. What if this was not a place where people lived, but a place where they came to produce? The idea of a workshop site has often been proposed, but even that explanation raises more questions than it answers. Who organized this production? Where did the people come from? And why is there no trace of their presence beyond the tools themselves? The second mystery lies in the tools themselves. Acheulean hand axes are known for their teardrop shape, but at Isimila, many exhibit a level of symmetry and consistency that appears almost standardized. Their edges are carefully flaked, their proportions balanced, and their forms repeated with striking regularity. This suggests more than simple craftsmanship. It implies knowledge transfer, perhaps even teaching, and a shared understanding of what a correct tool should look like. In modern terms, it hints at something resembling a production template. Yet this raises a deeper question. How could early humans, often assumed to operate with relatively simple cognitive frameworks, achieve such consistency without written instruction, without measurement tools, and without formal systems of design? The third mystery emerges from the landscape itself. The dramatic pillars and gullies of Isimila are the result of intense erosion. Over thousands of years, water has reshaped the terrain, carving away softer sediments and redistributing materials across the site. This complicates everything, because it introduces the possibility that the tools are no longer where they were originally made or used. They may have been transported, shifted, concentrated, and reassembled by natural forces into the patterns we observe today. If this is true, then Isimila may not be a workshop at all. It may be an illusion, a natural collection point that has gathered artifacts from multiple locations and time periods into one place. But if that is the case, why do so many of the tools remain intact? Why do they not show the level of damage or randomness one would expect from extensive transportation? The fourth mystery concerns purpose. Even if we accept that Isimila functioned as a production site, the scale of output remains difficult to justify. A small group of hunter-gatherers would not require tens of thousands of tools for survival. So who were these tools for? One possibility is that they were produced for exchange, suggesting the existence of early trade networks far more complex than traditionally assumed. Another is that the site served as a training ground where individuals learned the skill of tool-making through repetition. A more speculative idea is that the accumulation of tools held symbolic or ritual significance, that production itself was part of a behavior we do not yet understand. Each hypothesis offers a piece of the puzzle. None of them complete it. Subsequent excavations throughout the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st have expanded our understanding of Isimila, but they have not resolved its central contradictions. Stratigraphic studies have revealed multiple layers of occupation or activity, suggesting that the site was used repeatedly over extended periods. Detailed analysis of the tools has shown variations in technique and raw material, indicating that different groups or at least different phases of production may be represented. Some tools appear freshly made, while others show signs of use, resharpening, or discard. Geological studies have confirmed that erosion has played a significant role in shaping the site, but the extent to which it has altered the original distribution of artifacts remains debated. What has become increasingly clear is that Isimila cannot be explained by a single event or a single function. It is a layered record of behavior, shaped both by human activity and by natural processes over immense spans of time. Isimila does not offer easy answers. It does not present a clear narrative of human progress or a simple example of early technology. Instead, it confronts us with contradictions between simplicity and complexity, between randomness and pattern, between what we expect of the past and what the evidence actually shows. Perhaps that is what makes it so powerful as a subject of study, because in a place with no written history, no monuments, and no obvious meaning, we are forced to rely entirely on inference. And inference, in a landscape like this, is never certain. Was Isimila an ancient production center, a training ground, a ritual space, or something else entirely? Or more unsettling still, are we looking at a site we think we understand, when in reality, we are only seeing the result of processes we have yet to fully comprehend? The tools remain, silent, precise, and waiting for an explanation that has yet to come. A famine that lasted 7 years, carved into stone with absolute certainty, a king in despair, a god who controls the Nile, and a promise that restores life to an entire civilization. It reads like history, precise, confident, complete, but the stone itself is lying, because the story it tells was carved more than 2,000 years after it supposedly happened, and that changes everything. What if this is not a record of the past, but a carefully constructed memory? What if one of ancient Egypt's most compelling historical accounts is not history at all, but a message, deliberately designed to survive forever? The inscription known today as the Famine Stela lies etched into a massive granite outcrop on Sehel Island, a small island in the Nile just south of Aswan. This region, marked by cataracts and jagged rock formations, was historically a threshold, a natural gateway between Egypt and Nubia, and more importantly, a symbolic frontier of the Nile's mysterious origins. Sehel Island is not unique for its inscriptions. Hundreds of carvings, names, prayers, dedications cover its surfaces, left by officials, travelers and priests over centuries. But among them, the Famine Stela stands apart. It is not a name or a simple offering. It is a narrative, a fully formed story, composed with intention, carved with permanence. And unlike most inscriptions, it does not speak about its own time. Although known locally for centuries, the Famine Stela entered scholarly awareness during the 19th century, when European Egyptologists began systematically documenting inscriptions across Upper Egypt. Its hieroglyphs, though weathered, were remarkably legible. Translation revealed something unexpected, not a routine dedication, but a detailed account of a national crisis. The text describes events during the reign of Djoser, a pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty who ruled around 2700 BCE, best known for commissioning the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. According to the stela, Egypt suffered a devastating 7-year famine under his rule. Crops failed. The Nile did not flood. The land withered. Djoser, desperate, seeks answers from priests and scholars. Eventually, he turns to the god Khnum, believed to control the source of the Nile from the island of Elephantine nearby. In a dream, Khnum promises to restore the river on one condition, that the king grants land, wealth, and privileges to his temple. Djoser agrees. The Nile returns. The famine ends. It is a complete narrative cause, crisis, divine intervention, resolution. There is only one problem. The inscription itself dates not to Djoser's time, but to the Ptolemaic period, around the 3rd century BCE, more than 2 millennia later. Subsequent archaeological work in the region has confirmed the broader historical landscape. Elephantine Island, just across from Sehel, was indeed a major cult centre for Khnum. Excavations have uncovered temples, administrative buildings, and records of economic activity tied to the priesthood. These findings support one part of the stela's story, the importance of Khnum's cult and its association with the Nile's inundation. Ancient Egyptians understood, at least observationally, that the river's flooding determined survival. Nilometers stone structures used to measure water levels have been found throughout Egypt, including in this region, indicating a systematic effort to track and predict floods. However, no archaeological evidence confirms a specific 7-year famine during Djoser's reign. No contemporary inscriptions, no administrative records, no corroborating texts. Instead, what archaeologists find is silence, a gap where such a catastrophic event should have left traces. The first and most immediate mystery is temporal. Why would a detailed account of an Old Kingdom event be carved during the Ptolemaic era? Ancient Egypt did preserve memory across long periods, but typically through copies of older texts, not entirely new inscriptions claiming to recount distant events with such narrative clarity. The Famine Stela does not present itself as a copy. It presents itself as authority. Its language is formal, its structure deliberate, its message unmistakable. It does not question the past, it defines it. This raises a critical possibility, that the stela is not preserving history, but constructing it. A closer reading reveals that the heart of the inscription is not the famine itself, but the resolution. The granting of land and privileges to the Temple of Khnum occupies a central role described in legal and economic detail. This is not incidental storytelling. It reads like a decree. During the Ptolemaic period, Egypt was ruled by a Greek dynasty following the conquests of Alexander the Great. Native religious institutions, including temples, retained influence but operated within a complex political environment. Land ownership, taxation, and temple privileges were matters of negotiation and power. In this context, the Famine Stela begins to resemble something else entirely, a justification. By anchoring temple privileges in the distant and revered past, under a pharaoh as ancient and respected as Djoser, the inscription creates a narrative of legitimacy. It suggests that these rights were not recent grants, but sacred inheritances, established in a time when gods directly intervened in human affairs. In modern terms, it functions almost like a legal document disguised as history. The narrative is rich with detail, dialogues between king and priest, descriptions of divine dreams, geographic references to the Nile's source. Yet this precision is part of the problem. Ancient mythological texts often contain symbolic language, fragmented storytelling, and variations across versions. The Famine Stela, by contrast, is unusually coherent. It reads with the clarity of something designed to persuade, not simply to remember. The more precise it becomes, the less it resembles organic historical memory. Instead, it feels authored, carefully constructed, shaped for an audience. At its core, the story attributes the famine to the failure of the Nile's inundation and its resolution to divine intervention. Today, we understand that the Nile's flooding is influenced by rainfall patterns in the Ethiopian highlands, subject to climatic variability over time. Long-term droughts are possible. Multi-year disruptions in flooding could occur, but the attribution of such events to a specific god and the resolution to a negotiated divine favor reflects a worldview where natural systems are interpreted through theology. The question is not whether ancient Egyptians believed this, but whether the authors of the Stela used that belief strategically. The deepest question raised by the Famine Stela is not about famine, or even Egypt. It is about authorship. If a civilization can carve a story into stone, present it as truth, anchor it in a distant past, and ensure its survival for thousands of years, then the line between history and narrative begins to blur. The Stela forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that what survives is not always what happened, but what was chosen to be remembered. The Famine Stela stands on a silent island, its hieroglyphs enduring against time, erosion, and empire. It tells a story of crisis and salvation, of kings and gods, of a river that determines life itself. But beneath that story lies another quieter, more complex, and far more unsettling. A story about memory, about power, and about the possibility that even in the ancient world, history was not just recorded, it was written. Chandra Ketugar is a site that should not be this advanced, this connected, and yet this absent from history. It is not a lost city in the dramatic sense, not a civilization erased by a single catastrophic event, but something more unsettling, a place that reached a level of artistic precision, symbolic complexity, and economic integration that should have guaranteed its place in recorded history, yet somehow did not. No empire claims it, no detailed chronicle preserves it, and no definitive narrative explains its rise or its disappearance. And yet the physical evidence remains fragmented, scattered, and often detached from its original context. This is Chandra Ketugar, and it forces a different kind of question. Not what happened here, but how something like this could ever slip through the structure of history itself. Chandra Ketugar lies in the lowland plains of West Bengal in eastern India, not far from modern Kolkata, in a landscape that today appears ordinary, shaped by agriculture and seasonal monsoon cycles rather than memory. Yet beneath this quiet surface is evidence of continuous occupation from roughly the 4th century BCE to the 3rd century CE, spanning nearly 700 years of human activity. Its geographic position within the Ganges Delta would have placed it along critical riverine routes, natural corridors that connected inland settlements to the Bay of Bengal and the wider Indian Ocean network, suggesting from the outset that this was never an isolated settlement, but part of a larger system of movement, exchange, and interaction, even if that system was never formally recorded in surviving historical texts. The site first drew attention in the early 20th century when local discoveries of unusual artifacts, terracotta plaques, figurines, and inscribed seals began to surface, prompting intermittent archaeological interest. But unlike major sites such as Mohenjo-Daro or Taxila, Chandra Ketugar was never subjected to sustained, large-scale excavation capable of reconstructing its full structure or chronology. Excavations occurred in phases, often limited in scope, and more critically, many artifacts were not systematically catalogued, with some entering private collections or disappearing into antiquities markets, effectively severed from their original archaeological layers. In a field where context defines meaning, this loss is not just unfortunate but structurally damaging, leaving researchers with objects but without the complete story those objects were meant to tell. Despite these limitations, what has been recovered is enough to reveal a society that was organized, skilled, and deeply integrated into broader systems of production and exchange. Excavations have yielded terracotta plaques of extraordinary refinement, sculpted figurines with complex stylistic features, seals bearing symbols and scripts that remain only partially understood, as well as beads, ornaments, and materials that do not originate from the immediate region, all of which point toward a level of specialization and coordination that challenges any assumption of this being a marginal or peripheral settlement. The most striking of these finds are the terracotta plaques, which at first appear consistent with known artistic traditions of ancient India, but quickly reveal a level of execution that is difficult to reconcile with the expected technological context. These pieces display highly detailed jewelry composed of multiple layers, carefully rendered textile folds, and facial expressions that suggest observation rather than abstraction, with proportions that are controlled and repeated in ways that imply standardization. This is not casual craftsmanship, but systematic production, and comparisons to the artistic output of the Mauryan Empire are unavoidable. Yet even within that comparison, Chandra Ketugar's terracotta sometimes achieves a refinement that feels disproportionate to the simplicity of its medium. The problem is not that such craftsmanship exists, but that the tools, molds, or production systems that would logically support it have not been clearly identified, leaving a gap between what was produced and how it was produced, a mismatch that remains unresolved. Equally compelling is the evidence for long-distance trade embedded within the material record, where artifacts include non-local materials and stylistic elements that indicate interaction beyond the immediate region, suggesting that Chandra Ketugar functioned as part of a wider economic network. Its position along the Ganges Delta would have provided access to maritime routes linking South Asia with Southeast Asia, and potentially, through intermediaries, with the Mediterranean world, placing it within the broader Indian Ocean trade system. Yet this interpretation creates a contradiction, because while the physical evidence implies connectivity and exchange, the historical record does not clearly identify Chandra Ketugar as a major commercial centre, leaving open the possibility that it either operated under a different name that has not been securely linked, or existed as a functioning hub that remained largely outside formal historical documentation, a scenario that complicates conventional models of how trade networks are recorded and remembered. Beyond craft and commerce, the symbolic dimension of Chandra Ketugar introduces another layer of uncertainty, as many of the plaques depict figures and scenes that do not align cleanly with established religious iconography. Some figures appear human but stylized in unfamiliar ways. Others combine human and animal features, and certain compositions suggest ritual or narrative functions without clear parallels in early Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain traditions. This ambiguity suggests either a localized system of belief that developed independently or a symbolic language that has not survived in textual form. And without inscriptions that can be confidently deciphered, these images remain suspended between interpretation and speculation, reinforcing the sense that this was a cultural system only partially visible through the fragments that remain. What makes Chandra Ketugar particularly disorienting, however, is not only how it functioned, but how it ended, because there is no clear evidence of a catastrophic collapse, no definitive signs of invasion, destruction, or sudden environmental change. Instead, occupation appears to decline gradually, fading rather than breaking, which stands in contrast to many ancient urban centres where decline is linked to identifiable events. Here, the narrative dissolves without resolution, leaving behind a settlement that persisted for centuries and then receded from visibility without a clearly defined endpoint, as if it simply slipped out of the historical frame. What if one of the oldest traces of biblical belief quietly contradicts everything that came after it? Not in myth, not in legend, but written in ink on the surface of clay vessels left behind in a forgotten desert outpost, words that were never meant to be preserved and yet survived for nearly 3,000 years. Words that suggest something unsettling, something that does not fit the narrative we think we understand. Because at Kuntillet Ajrud, a place with no grand temple, no monumental architecture, no political power, a simple inscription appears again and again in different forms. Blessed be by Yahweh and his Asherah. Not just Yahweh, but Yahweh and something else. Kuntillet Ajrud sits in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, the northeastern edge of the Sinai Peninsula, a dry, isolated expanse of rock and sand, far removed from the major urban centres of the ancient Near East. There are no rivers here, no fertile valleys, no reason, at least on the surface, for anything significant to exist. And yet, in the 8th century BCE, this site was occupied, not as a city, not as a fortress, but most likely as a caravanserai, a stopping point along trade routes connecting the kingdoms of the Levant with Egypt. Travellers passed through, merchants rested, messages were left behind. It was never meant to be important, which is precisely why what was found here is so difficult to explain. In 1975, Israeli archaeologist Ze'ev Meshel led an excavation at this remote site. What initially appeared to be the ruins of a modest desert structure quickly revealed something far more complex. Inside, archaeologists uncovered fragments of large storage jars pithoi covered not only in decorative imagery, but in inscriptions written in ancient Hebrew script. The writing was informal, almost casual, not carved into stone as an official declaration, but brushed onto clay in a way that suggests everyday use. This was not state propaganda. It was not a royal inscription. It was something closer to a personal message, and that is what makes it dangerous, because these inscriptions do not align with the later standardized form of Judaism. Instead, they hint at a religious world that was still fluid, still evolving, still unresolved. As excavation continued, more fragments emerged, each one adding another layer to the mystery. Multiple inscriptions were identified, written by different hands. This suggests that the site was used over time by various individuals, not controlled by a single authority. The messages vary in phrasing, but follow a similar structure. Blessings invoked in the name of Yahweh, sometimes specifying a regional form, Yahweh of Samaria, or Yahweh of Teman, and, in several cases, including the same unexpected addition, and his Asherah. The repetition matters. This was not a mistake. not a one-time anomaly. It appears to reflect a pattern of belief. Alongside the text, archaeologists discovered drawings crude, almost playful figures. Some resemble the Egyptian dwarf god Bez, with exaggerated features and frontal posture. Others depict animals or abstract shapes. None of them clearly match what we would expect from representations of Yahweh. This creates a contradiction. If these inscriptions invoke Yahweh, why are the accompanying images stylistically foreign? Why do they resemble deities from neighboring cultures, rather than anything uniquely Israelite? The deeper the excavation went, the less coherent the picture became. The central question revolves around a single word: Asherah. In the broader context of the ancient Near East, Asherah is known as a Canaanite goddess, often associated with fertility and motherhood. In some traditions, she is described as the consort of the high god El, but here, in these inscriptions, she appears in direct association with Yahweh, his Asherah. The phrasing implies possession, relationship, connection. But what kind? One interpretation suggests that Asherah was indeed understood as a divine partner, a remnant of an earlier polytheistic system that had not yet been fully erased. Another proposes that Asherah refers not to a goddess, but to a cultic object, perhaps a sacred pole or tree used in ritual practice. Yet this explanation raises its own problems. Why use personal language, his Asherah, if referring to an object? Why not describe it more directly? A third theory suggests that Asherah may represent a symbolic extension of Yahweh himself, a localized manifestation of divine presence. But this, too, feels like an attempt to reconcile the text with a later theological framework. None of these explanations fully resolve the tension, because the inscriptions do not behave like controlled doctrine. They behave like belief in transition. Traditional narratives describe early Israelite religion as moving steadily toward monotheism, the exclusive worship of a single universal God. By the time biblical texts were compiled and standardized, this idea had become foundational. But Kuntillet Ajrud suggests a different trajectory. Instead of a clean evolution, we see fragmentation, overlap, contradiction, regional variations of Yahweh, references to other divine entities, imagery borrowed from neighboring cultures, a blending of traditions that does not fit the later, purified version of belief. This is not the religion as it was eventually recorded. This is the religion as it may have actually been lived. And the difference between those two versions may be the most important gap in the entire story. Sites like Tel Dan Stele provide official inscriptions, carefully constructed messages meant to project power and legitimacy. They are controlled, deliberate, consistent. Kuntillet Ajrud is none of those things. It is informal, fragmented, unpolished, and that is precisely why it may be more honest, because it captures something rarely preserved in the archaeological record: the beliefs of ordinary people expressed without oversight, without censorship, without the need to conform. It shows us a version of the past that was never meant to be seen. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Kuntillet Ajrud is not what it reveals, but what it implies. If these inscriptions represent a genuine strand of early belief, then at some point that strand was removed, edited out, rewritten, not necessarily through deception, but through the natural process of consolidation, of turning a diverse set of traditions into a single, unified system. History, in this sense, is not just recorded, it is refined, and sometimes what gets left behind tells a more complicated story than what survives. Because in a remote desert outpost, far from the centers of power, a few lines of ink still remain, quietly suggesting that the past was never as simple as we were told. Something did not destroy this city. There are no burned walls, no shattered gates, no mass graves marking the aftermath of a violent end. Instead, everything simply stops, Administrative records end without warning. Agricultural activity vanishes. Entire districts fall silent. And then, for nearly 3 centuries, no one returns. Tel Leilan is not the story of a city that fell in war. It is the story of a system that failed so completely it erased itself, leaving behind only a layer of dust as evidence. Tel Leilan lies in the dry plains of northeastern Syria, within the Khabur River basin, a region that today appears harsh and marginal, but once supported one of the most productive agricultural systems in northern Mesopotamia. Around 4,200 years ago, this was a landscape of organized fields, seasonal cycles, and coordinated labor, forming a critical node in the wider network of the Akkadian Empire. Unlike southern Mesopotamia, where irrigation dominated, Tel Leilan depended largely on rainfall-based agriculture, a system efficient under stable conditions but inherently vulnerable to shifts in climate. What appears now as emptiness was once a carefully calibrated balance between environment and human organization. Modern excavation began in the late 20th century under the direction of archaeologists from Yale University, and from the beginning, Tel Leilan presented an anomaly. Instead of chaotic destruction layers typical of war or fire, archaeologists uncovered a sharply defined occupational sequence. Dense habitation layers filled with structures, artifacts, and administrative records, followed by a distinct pale layer of wind-blown dust, and above that, a prolonged absence of human activity. This clean break in the archaeological records suggested something abrupt yet non-violent, a disappearance rather than a destruction, raising questions that could not be answered by traditional historical explanations. Before its collapse, Tel Leilan functioned as a highly organized center of agricultural production and administration. Cuneiform tablets reveal a structured bureaucracy managing grain distribution, labor assignments, and economic exchanges, indicating a level of coordination far beyond that of a simple settlement. The surrounding plains supported large-scale dry farming, producing surplus that fed not only the local population but also contributed to the broader economic system of the Akkadian state. In many ways, Tel Leilan represents an early form of agricultural intensification, a proto-industrial system built on efficiency, scale, and predictability, yet deeply dependent on consistent environmental conditions. Around 2200 BCE, this system reaches a sudden and unexplained halt. Buildings show no signs of destruction, storage facilities are left unused, and administrative records cease abruptly. What replaces human activity is a layer of fine dust, deposited by wind across the abandoned city. This layer corresponds to a global climatic disruption known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, a period characterized by severe and prolonged drought, affecting multiple regions of the ancient world. Geoarchaeological analysis confirms that the dust at Tel Leilan is Aeolian in origin, indicating intensified aridity and reduced vegetation cover, while pollen studies reveal a shift from cultivated crops to drought-resistant species, signaling a rapid transformation of the environment that would have undermined the agricultural foundation of the settlement. The decline of Tel Leilan aligns closely with the fragmentation of the Akkadian Empire, suggesting that the effects of climate change were not confined to a single site, but extended across an entire political and economic system. Contemporary records from Mesopotamia describe famine, social unrest, and migration, pointing to widespread disruption. What makes Tel Leilan particularly significant is the clarity with which its archaeological record reflects these broader patterns, providing physical evidence for a systemic collapse that written sources alone only partially capture. The synchronization between environmental data and historical events transforms Tel Leilan from a local mystery into a key piece of a much larger puzzle. Despite the evidence for environmental stress, a fundamental question remains: why did the system fail so completely? The societies of Mesopotamia possessed advanced knowledge of agriculture, organization, and resource management. Yet at Tel Leilan there is little evidence of adaptation or transition. One explanation lies in the inherent fragility of large-scale dry farming, which depends entirely on rainfall and offers limited resilience in the face of prolonged drought. Another possibility is structural rigidity, where centralized systems optimized for efficiency become less capable of responding to rapid change. Rather than gradually adjusting, the system at Tel Leilan appears to have reached a critical threshold beyond which continuation was no longer possible, resulting in a sudden and total abandonment. Subsequent excavations have reinforced this interpretation, refining the timeline and strengthening the connection between environmental change and societal collapse. Stratigraphic analysis demonstrates that the transition from occupation to abandonment occurred within a relatively short period, likely measured in decades rather than centuries. Artifacts from the final phase of habitation suggest that the city was still functioning normally shortly before its disappearance, with no clear signs of decline leading up to the event. This abruptness challenges traditional models of gradual societal collapse, and instead points to a tipping point scenario where accumulated stress results in rapid systemic failure. Tel Leilan offers no dramatic final moment, no singular event that can be identified as the cause of its fall. Instead, it reveals a more complex and unsettling reality, a system built on stability that could not survive instability. There were no invading armies, no catastrophic battles, only a shift in climate that altered the conditions upon which everything depended. Buried beneath layers of dust, the site preserves one of the clearest archaeological records of climate-driven collapse in human history, serving not only as a window into the past, but also as a reminder of the vulnerabilities inherent in complex systems. The silence of Tel Leilan is not just an echo of what once was, but a question that remains unanswered. How resilient are the systems we depend on today, and would we recognize the warning signs before it is too late? It is not large, it is not elaborate, and yet it may be one of the most unsettling objects ever found in prehistoric archaeology. A small piece of flint, shaped uncannily like a human face, two shallow depressions where eyes should be, a fragment of bone inserted precisely where a nose would sit, not carved in the way we recognize as art, not sculpted with tools we can clearly trace, but arranged, adjusted, and somehow intentional. What makes this object extraordinary is not how it looks, but when it was made. More than 75,000 years ago, in a time when modern humans had not yet reached this part of Europe, something or someone placed that nose into the stone. If this was deliberate, then it was not made by us. It was made by another human species, Neanderthals. And if that is true, then this is not just a face. It is a message from a mind we were never supposed to recognize. The object was discovered inside the cave of La Roche-Cotard, located in the Loire Valley of western France, a region better known for medieval castles than for rewriting the story of human cognition. The cave itself is modest, partially collapsed, and for thousands of years remained sealed behind layers of sediment. Unlike famous decorated caves such as Lascaux Cave, La Roche-Cotard contains no sweeping murals, no vivid depictions of animals, no obvious artistic tradition. It is quiet, almost empty, and that is precisely what makes the discovery inside it so disturbing. Because whatever happened here was not part of a larger artistic culture we can easily identify. It was isolated, singular, and possibly far older than any known symbolic object in Western Europe. The so-called mask was first identified in the late 20th century by French archaeologist Jean-Claude Marquet. At first glance, it did not stand out. It was simply a piece of flint, irregular in shape, with a lighter fragment lodged within it. But closer inspection revealed something deeply unusual. The flint contained natural cavities that resembled eye sockets. This alone could be dismissed as coincidence. Nature produces patterns, and the human brain is remarkably good at seeing faces where none exist, a psychological phenomenon known as pareidolia. But the bone fragments changed everything. It had been inserted into a groove in the stone, not loosely, not randomly, but with enough force and precision to remain fixed in place. Positioned exactly where a nose would be, it completed the illusion of a face with unsettling accuracy. This was no longer just a trick of the mind. It was a composition. The question was no longer what it looked like, but whether someone had intended it to look that way. At the heart of the Roche-Cotard Mask lies a deceptively simple question. Is this object the result of natural processes or of deliberate human action? The argument for coincidence is grounded in caution. Flint fractures in unpredictable ways. Bones can become lodged in crevices through geological movement, and the human tendency toward pareidolia means we are primed to interpret ambiguous shapes as faces. But this explanation struggles under closer scrutiny. The placement of the bone is not random. It aligns with the central axis of the face. It is proportionate. It completes a pattern that already suggests symmetry. More importantly, the bone appears to have been intentionally wedged into place, requiring pressure and direction. If this was accidental, it is an extraordinary accident. If it was intentional, then it represents something far more profound. The deliberate creation, or at least enhancement of a symbolic image. And that possibility carries enormous implications. For decades, the debate remained unresolved, largely because the age of the object and its context could not be firmly established. Without precise dating, it was always possible to argue that modern humans had passed through the area and left the object behind. That uncertainty changed in the early 21st century. Using advanced techniques such as optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, researchers analysed the sediments that had sealed the cave entrance. The results were striking. The cave had been closed off for approximately 75,000 years. At that time, there were no modern humans in this region of Europe. The only known inhabitants were Neanderthals. This effectively eliminated the possibility that Homo sapiens created the object. The mask, if intentional, must belong to Neanderthals. And that conclusion challenges one of the most persistent assumptions in paleoanthropology. For much of modern scientific history, Neanderthals were portrayed as cognitively limited, capable of survival, tool use, and perhaps rudimentary social behavior, but lacking the symbolic thinking associated with art, language, and abstract representation. Objects like the Roche-Cotard Mask disrupt that narrative, because this object serves no practical function. It is not a tool. It does not improve survival. It does not process food, build shelter, or defend against predators. Its only apparent purpose is to be seen, and more specifically, to be recognized as something else. A face. Recognizing a face is one of the most complex perceptual abilities the human brain possesses. Creating one, even in abstract form, requires an additional layer, the ability to map meaning onto form, to impose intention onto material. If Neanderthals did this, even once, then they possessed a form of symbolic cognition we have long denied them. And if they possessed it, then the origins of art and perhaps even of imagination must be pushed much further back in time. Subsequent investigations at La Roche-Cotard have not revealed a gallery of similar objects. There is no collection of masks, no progression of artistic styles, no clear evidence of a sustained symbolic tradition within the cave. Instead, the site remains defined by its singularity. Researchers have, however, identified additional traces of Neanderthal presence, stone tools, modified surfaces, and possible engravings on the cave walls. Some studies suggest that Neanderthals at this site may have engaged in activities that went beyond mere subsistence, including the deliberate marking of surfaces. These findings do not conclusively prove artistic intent, but they reinforce the possibility that the mask is not an isolated anomaly. Rather, it may be the surviving fragment of a cognitive world we can barely reconstruct. Why create a face? Was it symbolic, ritualistic, or simply experimental? Did it represent another individual or an abstract concept? Was it meant to be seen by others or only by its creator? And perhaps most importantly, how many other objects like this have been overlooked, dismissed as coincidence, ignored because they did not fit our expectations? The Roche-Cotard Mask forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that the boundary between us and them may not be as clear as we once believed. In the end, the Roche-Cotard Mask does not offer clear answers. It does something far more unsettling. It suggests that tens of thousands of years ago, in a quiet cave in what is now France, a Neanderthal may have looked at a piece of stone and seen a face. And then, instead of walking away, they chose to complete it. Not for survival, not for necessity, but for a reason we still do not understand. If that moment truly happened, then this object is not just an artifact. It is evidence of recognition, of intention, of thought that reaches beyond the immediate world. A face, shaped in darkness long before history began. Tello obelisk is a single block of stone that appears to store information without using language. At first glance, it looks like a chaotic collision of fangs, claws, feathers, and scales. But the longer you look, the more structured it becomes. Patterns repeat, forms interlock. Every line seems to belong to more than one creature at once. This is not decoration, and it is not random. It is a system. And if it is a system, then it was designed to be understood. The problem is that nearly 3,000 years later, we no longer know how to read it. High in the Peruvian Andes, at an altitude of over 3,000 meters, lies Chavin de Huantar, a site that does not behave like a typical ancient settlement. There are no wide residential districts or clear evidence of a large permanent population. Instead, the landscape is dominated by a carefully engineered ceremonial complex of massive stone platforms, sunken plazas, and a labyrinth of underground galleries. Sound behaves unpredictably here, where whispers can echo like distant roars, and water channels beneath the structure generate low, continuous vibrations. Light is controlled through narrow openings, illuminating specific spaces while leaving others in darkness, turning the entire complex into an environment designed to manipulate perception. Within this system, the Tello obelisk did not exist as an isolated artifact, but as part of a larger sensory experience that combined architecture, acoustics, and imagery into something closer to a controlled ritual environment than a conventional temple. The obelisk was identified in the early 20th century by Julio C. Tello, a pioneering figure in South American archaeology. By the time it was studied, it had already been removed from its original position, leaving its precise ceremonial role uncertain. But the object itself was unmistakable. A monolithic stone approximately 2.5 meters tall, carved on all sides with extraordinary density. From the beginning, researchers understood that this was not a conventional relief or narrative scene, because no single image could be isolated without referencing another. Every figure was entangled within others, sharing outlines and structural lines, making it impossible to separate individual forms without losing the integrity of the whole. Unlike the Rosetta Stone, which provided a bridge between languages, the Tello obelisk offered no translation, no parallel text, and no interpretive guide. It presented information clearly and deliberately, but it provided no instructions for decoding it. The most striking feature of the obelisk is not any single creature, but the way multiple creatures merge into one continuous structure. A single carved line can simultaneously define the jaw of a feline, the body of a serpent, and the wing of a bird, creating layered imagery where forms overlap and transform depending on how they are viewed. Teeth become repeating patterns, patterns become scales, and scales transition into feathers, forming a visual network rather than a collection of separate figures. At least 3 ecological domains are represented, including river animals such as caimans, jungle predators like jaguars, and aerial birds of prey, each rendered with recognizable anatomical features, yet combined into hybrid entities that do not exist in nature. This creates a contradiction. If the carvings were purely symbolic, their integration is unusually systematic. And if they were purely decorative, their repetition is too structured to be random. One interpretation is that the obelisk functions as a non-linear encoding system in which meaning is not read sequentially but constructed through relationships between forms, similar to how compressed data stores multiple layers of information within a single space. The difficulty is that without knowledge of the original interpretive system, the structure remains visible but the meaning remains inaccessible. The presence of certain species introduces an additional layer of complexity, particularly animals such as caimans that are native to lowland tropical environments rather than high-altitude Andean regions. Their depiction on the obelisk is anatomically precise enough to suggest direct observation rather than imagination, implying that the Chavin culture either maintained long-distance contact networks spanning hundreds of kilometers or had access to a system of knowledge exchange that left minimal physical evidence. In civilizations such as ancient Egypt, awareness of distant fauna is supported by trade records and inscriptions. But at Chavin, the informational network that would explain such knowledge remains largely invisible. The data is present in the carvings, but the mechanism behind its transmission is not. Equally difficult to explain is the technical execution of the obelisk, which was carved from a hard stone using tools that likely consisted of other stones and abrasive materials rather than metal implements. Despite these limitations, the carvings exhibit continuous, controlled lines with a high degree of consistency and no obvious large-scale errors or corrections. Experimental archaeology suggests that reproducing such dense and interlocking designs without mistakes would require not only time, but also an advanced level of planning, as the entire composition would need to be understood before carving began. Once a line was cut, it could not be reversed, meaning that the creators had to visualize a highly complex, multi-layered structure in advance. This shifts the question from how the obelisk was carved to how it was conceptualized, because the precision observed is not just a product of technique, but of design. Further archaeological work at Chavin de Huantar has revealed that the obelisk was part of a broader symbolic and architectural system rather than a standalone artifact. Underground galleries connect different parts of the complex. Acoustic properties amplify sound in controlled ways, and at the center stands the lanzon, a towering carved figure placed deep within the structure. Movement through these spaces would have been highly controlled, guiding participants through darkness, sound distortions, and sudden visual encounters with carved imagery. Within this context, the Tello obelisk may have functioned as a component of a larger ritual sequence rather than an object intended for isolated interpretation, suggesting that its meaning was experienced rather than read. Each excavation has added layers of context to this interpretation, revealing more about how the site functioned as a sensory environment, but none have provided a definitive method for decoding the imagery itself. The Tello obelisk presents a paradox that remains unresolved. Its structure is too consistent to be random, its imagery too deliberate to be purely decorative, and its integration too complex to be accidental, yet it remains